Hi guys. Tonight we step into a hut that is not much bigger than your living room, but colder than you probably want to imagine. The year is somewhere in the 1302nd. The place is a muddy village lane, and outside a cutting wind slices through the thatch. You push open the door, and instantly a blast of smoky, damp air hits your lungs. It clings to your clothes, makes your eyes water, and fills your nostrils with a pungent mix of wood smoke, animal manure, and the sour tang of unwashed wool. You blink into the gloom, your breath making visible clouds in front of your face. You think, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this winter night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments where you are in the world right now, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, and imagine yourself standing there in the doorway, listening to the creak of the rafters under their weight of snow. You tread carefully across the dirt floor, and your boots crunch on frost that has formed inside the hut. It is dark except for the faint glow of the hearth in the center, where a few logs struggle to smolder. Smoke curls lazily upward, or at least tries to. It collects thickly beneath the low rafters, since the hole in the roof doesn't draw well. You cough. Your eyes sting. For a moment, you wonder if sleeping outside might be more breathable. Yet this is what counted as warmth for peasants in the Middle Ages. Archaeologists studying preserved medieval homes in England and Scandinavia have found blackened beams thick with soot, proof that these houses doubled as chimneys. It was a fact of daily life. If you wanted heat, you lived in smoke. Scholars still disagree over whether constant smoke inhalation contributed more to lung disease than to parasite control, because the smoke did kill some insects, in a small mercy. You glance around and realize the walls are wattle and Daub branches plastered with mud. They look solid enough, but in truth they bleed cold air through every seam. You reach out, touch one with your palm, and feel a hard crust, almost frozen to the touch. A thin draft snakes down your sleeve. Medieval building regulations, such as they were, didn't involve insulation. What you had was mud, straw, and prayer. Still, you notice the effort to make it home. Herbs hang drying above the hearth, their scent faint under the smoke. A crucifix of rough wood leans in a corner. A few pots, patched with lead, line the shelf. You crouch near the fire and extend your hands, but the warmth fades almost as quickly as it touches your skin. No wonder families went to bed early. Why waste daylight on freezing wakefulness when lying down together conserved at least some heat? You think about the sheer vulnerability of these nights. Wolves roamed the edges of villages. Thieves sometimes struck when doors were only wooden latches, and the darkness itself was frightening. In winter, night lasted 14 or more hours. Imagine being confined in a smoke-filled box that long. Perhaps that's why people turned bedtime into a communal affair. Families sang, told tales, prayed, and shared silence before drifting to sleep. One quirky tidbit: records from manorial courts occasionally mention fines for excessive noise at night, suggesting even peasants complained about rowdy neighbors through those thin walls. Apparently, medieval village life could be noisy, even in the dead of winter. As you sit there by the hearth, you notice frost forming on the inside of the thatched roof. Now and then, it melts in droplets that fall like little icy needles onto your back. Children scamper barefoot across the earthen floor, unfazed, their feet hardened by a life lived close to the ground. They dive under a heap of straw where blankets are waiting, squealing at the cold before the mass of bodies warms them up. You're invited, of course. A hand beckons from the darkened corner. You hesitate. You like your modern bed too much, but curiosity wins. You shuffle over and peer down at the bed. It's nothing more than a raised wooden platform shoved against the wall, topped with a heap of straw, flattened wool sacks, and patched rags. Yet in this dim hut, it is the center of life. It's where you sleep, eat, gossip, nurse the sick, even give birth. In winter, it becomes your refuge. You slide down and feel the crunch of straw beneath you, prickly against your skin, and you understand. It's not comfortable, but it's survival. Every creak of timber and whistle of wind outside reminds you how thin the line is between warmth and freezing. Your mind drifts. How many winters could a peasant endure like this? Historical records show high mortality rates, especially among infants and the elderly, in winter months. Yet families clung to life with remarkable resilience. Some historians argue that peasants simply accepted suffering as part of God's plan, while others suggest they developed coping strategies we underestimate. The debate continues, but tonight, lying on straw under a smoke-stained roof, you sense both suffering and resilience woven together. Your eyelids grow heavy as the hearth embers fade to faint orange. You can still hear the muffled grumble of livestock outside, penned close to the hut for safety. Soon, they'll join you literally inside. But that, you realize, is another layer of winter survival. For now, you lie still, listening to the drip of thawing frost, the hiss of smoke, and the steady breathing of those around you, and you know the long winter night has only just begun. You wake in the dim half-light of dawn and feel something prickling against your cheek. It is straw, coarse and scratchy, poking through a rough linen sack. You shift your weight and hear the rustle, like dry leaves being crushed, and suddenly you are aware of dozens of little movements beneath you. Fleas, lice, mites. Your skin itches even before you truly feel them. Welcome to a medieval bed. Most peasants didn't have wooden frames or soft mattresses. What you have is a sack of straw, sometimes stuffed with hay, reeds, or even moss if times were desperate. It is called a palliasse. Every few months, families replaced the filling, because after a season it became flattened, damp, and alive with tiny creatures. Imagine lying down at night already resigned to scratching until you dozed off. This was daily reality. One mainstream fact here. Medieval documents and later accounts describe these straw mattresses as standard furnishings in poor households across Europe. In some places, wealthier peasants might have added a thin wool coverlet, but mostly it was straw in a sack. And yes, historians still argue whether these sacks were placed directly on the floor or on crude wooden frames. Evidence varies by region. Excavated homes in Scandinavia suggest simple raised platforms, while English cottages show impressions of bedding straight on earthen floors. You roll over, and the straw pokes through again, stabbing into your shoulder. A pungent smell rises, sweet at first, then sour, because damp straw soon turns musty. You wrinkle your nose and wonder how anyone fell asleep here. Yet people did. Exhausted from dawn to dusk, labor in fields or workshops. Fatigue overcame discomfort, and bodies pressed together masked the worst of the smell. One quirky tidbit. Some records mention peasants using chaff, the husks left after threshing grain, as mattress stuffing. It was abundant, free, and unfortunately sharp. Imagine sleeping in a sack full of razor-like fragments. Not exactly luxury memory foam, but when your choices are sharp husks or freezing dirt, you learn to be grateful. As you settle back down, you notice how noisy Straw Island. Every movement is an announcement. A squeak, a crunch, a sighing sound. Children tossing and turning would set off a chorus of rustles. Privacy was non-existent, of course, but the soundscape of a medieval night was a thing unto itself. Creaks, snores, whispers, scratching animals, and the constant crunch of straw formed the lullaby of the village. You close your eyes and think of how modern people treat beds as sanctuaries. Here, though, the bed is more of a functional patch of ground, just enough to separate you from Earth's chill. Comfort was not the goal. Survival was. You wonder whether your back would last a single season on such a lumpy heap. Chronic pain must have been common. There are even medieval remedies recorded for stiff joints from lying, often involving warm compresses of herbs. Scholars sometimes debate whether poor posture and hard beds shortened working lives, though others argue the endless farm labor was culprit enough. A sudden itch crawls up your arm. You scratch furiously. You're not imagining it. Bedbugs were a medieval plague long before they became a modern hotel horror story. Herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and wormwood were burned or tucked under straw to repel them, though their effectiveness was doubtful. Some peasants smoked their bedding deliberately, hanging sacks above hearths to kill vermin. The result? Bedding that smelled like a bonfire, still better than an infestation. In the corner, an elderly woman mutters about changing the straw tomorrow. She means pulling the whole mattress apart, tossing out the mouldy chaff, and stuffing the sack with fresh cuttings. This task usually fell to women and children, and though it was messy, it was essential. Neglected straw beds could harbour rot and disease. One historical fact notes that hospitals and monasteries also relied on straw bedding, replaced regularly as part of hygiene routines. Even in the humblest village hut, this wisdom was known. You shift again, and a small avalanche of straw dusts your face. You sneeze, startling a child beside you. The child giggles, pulling the blanket higher. And for a moment, despite the fleas, the itch, the mustiness, you feel something strangely cozy. This prickly heap of straw is not meant to be comfortable, but it is warm when packed with bodies. It is familiar. It is family. Still, your modern mind can't quite accept it. You long for springs, feathers, memory foam, anything that doesn't crawl. But the reality is that peasants endured night after night of this, year after year, and managed to wake, stretch, and return to labour. As you lie back, scratching absent-mindedly, you realize how much resilience is woven into every straw of this bed. You sigh, your breath visible in the cold air, and listen to the rustle of straw as everyone settles again, waiting for true sleep to come. You shift in the straw, still itchy from the phantom crawling on your skin, and you realize something else. There is no such thing as your bed, not in this hut. The entire family sleeps together on one broad, sagging platform, and you are now pressed between shoulders, knees, elbows, and the occasional sharp little heel belonging to a child who dreams in kicks. Privacy? Forget it. In a medieval peasant's life, bedtime was communal, crowded, and filled with the intimacy of sheer necessity. The air is thick with warmth from shared breath. Every inhale carries the scent of wool, smoke, and earth, and every exhale clouds faintly in the cold before vanishing. The walls are too thin to hold heat, so the only reliable heater is flesh against flesh. You turn your head and bump noses with a child. She giggles, then burrows back under a patched blanket. You feel someone else's rough hand resting on your arm, grandfather maybe, or an older brother, and though the touch is accidental, you leave it. Everyone relies on everyone else. One mainstream historical fact: in much of medieval Europe, entire households shared one sleeping space, often a single raised bed or large pile of bedding. Court records and folk tales confirm this, describing families huddled together in a heap. The practice wasn't just cultural, it was survival. In houses where temperatures dropped near freezing, especially in Northern Europe, you didn't waste heat by sleeping alone. Even wealthier peasants who had slightly more space usually still crammed multiple people into one bed. As your body adjusts, you notice how carefully the sleeping order is arranged. Children closest to the middle, shielded by adults on either side. Infants sometimes slept, swaddled against their mother's chest, wrapped so tightly in cloth that they looked more like a loaf of bread than a baby. Grandparents were often positioned at the edges, where it was colder, since the younger needed warmth more urgently. You can see how this simple arrangement both kept everyone alive and reinforced family bonds. And yet, scholars still disagree on the details. Did families always sleep in strict order, or did habits vary by region? Some argue that texts suggesting structured sleeping hierarchies might be moralizing exaggerations by clerics who disapproved of so much bodily closeness. Others say archaeological and folkloric evidence points to a very practical system of positioning for warmth. The debate lingers, and you, lying here with a stranger's knee against your ribs, Suspect the answer was probably both. One quirky tidbit makes you chuckle. Medieval jokes often teased peasants for their overcrowded beds. There are verses where a man claims he slept with his wife, his children, his servant, and the dog all on one mattress, a sort of medieval stand-up comedy routine. Apparently, even then, people found humor in the absurdity of a bed so crowded that you had to fight for elbow room. You roll onto your back, gazing up at the blackened rafters above, and feel a weight on your stomach. A toddler has clambered over you, wriggling until he finds a comfortable hollow beside your hip. His hair smells faintly of wood smoke and something sour milk, maybe. He sighs contentedly and drifts to sleep. It dawns on you that for medieval peasants this was more than practical. It was emotional security. Children didn't go to bed alone in a cold corner. They slept literally wrapped in the heartbeat of their family. But this closeness also had its tensions. Imagine lying shoulder to shoulder with your entire household after a long day. The snores, the shifting bodies, the occasional flatulent outburst because, yes, everyone ate beans, and beans did their work were part of the nightly soundtrack. You could not hide irritation. You simply endured, or teased, or laughed, and then endured again. You hear a cough at the far end of the bed, deep and rattling. An old man's chest wheezes with the sound of age and cold. Illness spread quickly in these cramped quarters. If one child brought home a winter fever, the whole family lay side by side in the contagion. Mortality rates for influenza, pneumonia, and even common colds were grim in medieval villages. Physicians of the time sometimes blamed bad air rising from the earth, while priests spoke of sin and God's punishment. But the physical reality was simple. Too many bodies, too little ventilation, and no concept of germs. The room settles into a rhythm. Someone snores in long, uneven bursts. A child whimpers and is hushed by a mother's whisper. You close your eyes again, trying to relax into the press of bodies, and find yourself thinking about what it must have meant for people's sense of self. Modern life prizes individuality, your own bed, your own space, your own sleep. But here, the self was blurred into the group. Your warmth was literally dependent on others. Perhaps that fostered resilience, or perhaps it bred frustration. Historians still debate whether communal sleeping strengthened family unity or created underlying tensions we can only guess at. Your feet brush against something warm and furry. For a moment you startle, thinking it's an animal because it very well could be. But no, it is just a sheepskin thrown over the bedding. Still, the reminder is there. The boundaries between human and beast, inside and outside, were porous in this world. Soon, livestock may even enter to share the warmth, as they often did. For now, though, it is just family pressed together, breath rising in pale clouds, straw rustling beneath. You notice, too, the rhythm of shared breath. It's oddly soothing, this chorus of inhales and exhales. You feel your chest matching theirs, as though your lungs have been drafted into a choir. You wonder if this kind of synchronization gave medieval sleepers a deeper sense of connection, or if it just meant everyone woke up whenever one person tossed or turned. Probably both. Another sneeze rattles the room. A child rubs her nose on her sleeve. You remember reading that snot was a winter constant, almost a season of its own. Without tissues, you wiped on whatever was at hand: wool, straw, your neighbour's tunic, and no one batted an eye. Life was messy, communal, and close. The longer you lie there, the more you realize that family bed didn't mean romance or luxury. It meant survival. It meant bodies stacked like firewood to make it through nights when temperatures outside could kill. You imagine the snow piling against the door, wolves howling in the distance, frost creeping down the inside of the walls. And here you are, pressed among snoring relatives, safe, uncomfortable, yes, but alive. Perhaps, you think, modern people underestimate how precious that warmth must have felt. When you have nothing but straw, a ragged blanket, and the shared heat of kin, you hold them close, not because you want to, but because you must. And in that necessity, maybe, there was comfort of another kind. You sigh into the darkness, scratching again at your arm, and let the murmur of voices fade as sleep pulls at you once more. Somewhere in the corner, the fire coughs out a last spark, and the room descends into deeper night, all of you breathing together, a single fragile organism waiting for dawn. The fire has slumped into a pile of glowing coals, and the hut seems even darker than before. Your nose twitches. There is a scent in the air that you didn't quite notice earlier, animal musk, mixed with the sharp tang of manure and damp wool. At first you think it has drifted in from outside, but when you turn your head, you realize the truth. A goat has ambled through the door, followed by a pig snuffling at the straw. You are no longer just sharing your bed with family. Tonight, the livestock are climbing in too. It may seem shocking, but for many medieval peasants this was common sense. Surviving records from manorial accounts in England and tax registers in parts of France show that most families owned only a few animals, perhaps a cow, a pig, some chickens, maybe a sheep or goat. Those beasts represented wealth and survival. Milk, wool, meat, manure for fields. To protect them from theft and the cold, families often invited them inside. If the house was only one room, that meant humans and animals bedded down together. You shuffle over as the pig plops into the straw with a sigh. Its warmth radiates immediately. It's not elegant, but you can't deny the benefit. An adult cow can generate more body heat than several people combined. Some historians highlight that this practice helped peasants maintain a tolerable indoor temperature in the worst winters. Others point out the downsides: disease, filth, and the constant danger of being stepped on by a hoof in the night. The scholarly consensus is divided. Was this clever adaptation or desperate compromise? Perhaps both at once. One odd little custom worth noting is that some villages in the Alps nicknamed the family cow the Hearth cow because her presence was as valuable as the fire itself. She didn't just give milk, she gave off steady warmth, like a living stove. Chronicles from the 15th century describe families placing children directly beside the animal, wrapped in blankets, so that their little bodies could soak up the cow's heat. You, lying here in the straw, start to understand why. The goat presses against your feet, and you feel the warmth rising. It is, against all odds, almost cozy. Still, it isn't idyllic. The goat sneezes, showering you with dampness. The pig snores louder than any human, grunting and shifting, its smell so pungent it curls your stomach. Fleas leap from animal fur into human hair without hesitation. And in spring, when animals birth their young indoors, you would be sleeping beside squealing piglets or calves struggling to stand for the first time. The boundaries between farmyard and bedroom blurred until they disappeared altogether. Imagine the soundscape: chickens clucking and rustling in the corner, a cow's heavy breath filling the room, the scuffle of hooves on the dirt floor. Add to that the cough of your grandfather, the whispers of your siblings, and the occasional crackle from the fire, and you have a symphony of rural survival. Sleep came not from silence but from exhaustion, your body finally surrendering despite the noise. Archaeologists excavating medieval dwellings in Scandinavia have found animal pens built directly into houses, with only low wooden partitions separating beasts from people. In some English cottages, the evidence suggests no barrier at all. The animals literally lived in the same space. Researchers continue to disagree about how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was nearly universal among the poor, while others suggest it varied by climate, with colder regions adopting it more. The lack of precise evidence leaves the debate open, but tonight, in your imagination, there is no doubt. You are nose to nose with a goat. You try to turn away from the smell, and your hand lands in something damp. You recoil. The pig has left you a small gift in the straw. That too was part of life. Families raked out manure every morning, sometimes spreading it directly onto fields. The very bedding you sleep on could later be scooped, dung and all, to fertilize crops. Waste was never really wasted. Still, as you wipe your hand on a ragged blanket, You can't help thinking that modern concepts of hygiene would not have survived here. The presence of animals wasn't just about warmth, it was also about security. Thieves prowled in hard winters, and stealing a pig or cow could cripple a family's livelihood. Bringing animals indoors kept them safe. Some medieval laws even prescribed fines for those caught stealing livestock at night, hinting at how common the crime was. By sleeping beside your cow, you weren't just gaining warmth, you were also standing guard. And there is another layer: companionship. Chroniclers occasionally remark on the affection peasants showed their beasts. A woman might hum to her cow, a child might cuddle a lamb like a pet. In nights this long and this cold, perhaps the comfort of another warm body, even an animal's, was worth the inconvenience. You glance at the goat dozing beside your feet and, against your better judgment, you feel a sliver of gratitude. But it was not without risk. Diseases could leap from animals to humans, though people didn't understand contagion in the modern sense. They spoke instead of bad airs or curses. Later research would reveal zoonotic illnesses like tuberculosis likely spread in such conditions. Some experts remain split on just how devastating these cross-species infections were, since peasants already faced so many other hazards. But lying here, coughing into the smoky air, you can imagine the health toll. The pig shifts again, pressing its heavy body against your side, and suddenly you're warmer than you've been all night. You sigh, letting the heat seep into your bones, even as the smell makes your eyes water. Survival often asks you to choose comfort over pride. You realize that in this cramped hut, with family on one side and livestock on the other, peasants found a balance. They endured the filth because the alternative was frostbite and death. The night lengthens. Outside, snow taps softly against the thatched roof. Inside, the goat sighs, the cow shuffles, your sister snores, and the fire fades. You are wrapped in a tapestry of human and animal life, woven together by necessity. You scratch at a flea bite, pull the blanket higher, and let the rough symphony lull you back toward sleep. And as you drift, you wonder not for the first time whether these peasants pitied themselves, or whether they simply accepted this strange intimacy as the way of the world. Maybe both. Either way, winter goes on, and the animals stay close. The night stretches on, and you become more aware of how fragile every layer of protection feels. The wind scratches against the wattle walls, slipping its fingers through cracks, and you instinctively pull something rougher and heavier across your shoulders. It is a patchwork of furs, wool scraps, and ragged cloth stitched together so many times that no original piece remains visible. You curl beneath it, grateful, though you feel the stiff seams scratching at your chin. This is the world of medieval coverings, more treasure than luxury. Surviving inventories from rural households show that blankets and furs were often among the most prized possessions. A simple wool coverlet might be listed alongside pots and tools when estates were divided, because textiles were costly to produce and lasted for generations. For poorer families, one blanket might serve them all. The word quilt, in the modern sense, was rare. What you feel over you is more like a heap of anything that holds warmth. Sometimes it was sheepskin, sometimes old clothes sewn into larger cloths, sometimes literal rags pieced together. You shift your weight, and the blanket slides, exposing a corner of rough fur. It smells faintly of smoke, mutton fat, and sweat, yet the heat it traps is undeniable. Wool, unlike linen, keeps insulating even when damp. Farmers knew this and spun whatever coarse wool they could gather into threads for weaving. Some wealthier peasants might even trade for dyed cloth, though the deep reds and blues were out of reach for most. Your blanket is a muddle of brown, grey, and faded green earth tones of survival rather than fashion. One peculiar detail mentioned in a 14th century chronicle is that villagers sometimes stuffed their covers with straw or reeds, effectively turning blankets into padded mats. Imagine the rustle each time you moved, like sleeping inside a scarecrow. It wasn't soft, but it created a little more distance between human skin and biting cold. You tug your own blanket tighter, half hoping not to hear that straw-like whisper inside. As you huddle beneath the coverings, you remember that these weren't merely functional items. They carried emotional weight. A mother's blanket might pass to her daughter, then her granddaughter. Patches told family stories, one square from a worn tunic, another from an old apron. Each ragged seam stitched together memories. You might not own silver, you might not own land, but you owned warmth, and that mattered. The fire pops faintly, sending a spark across the floor. Someone mutters in their sleep and pulls at the blanket, trying to claim more of it. You feel the familiar tug of war, and suddenly your toes are exposed to icy air. This nightly battle over shared coverings was so common that medieval jokes referenced it. Better to marry for a blanket than for love, one verse quipped, hinting that warmth could be more persuasive than romance. But there is a darker layer too. Chroniclers noted disputes over stolen textiles. A blanket was valuable enough to be pawned or stolen, and manorial courts sometimes punished villagers for taking each other's coverings. The fact that such cases appear in legal records proves how vital these ragged layers were. No one risked winter without them. Specialists can't quite agree on whether poorer households had true fur covers or only rough wool. In colder climates like Scandinavia, archaeological finds show sheepskins were common, sometimes laid fur side down against sleepers. In warmer areas, people may have made do with lighter cloths. The evidence is patchy, leaving room for interpretation. You, though, lying under this smoky heap of rags and skins, don't need an academic conclusion. You simply know the difference between shivering and surviving. Your nose catches another faint smell, lavender. Surprising in this smoky hut, but not impossible. Herbs were occasionally sewn into covers to repel insects or add fragrance. Women dried bunches in summer and tucked them into bedding for winter. Whether it truly deterred fleas is uncertain, but the scent brought comfort. You breathe deeply, grateful for even a trace of sweetness in the heavy air. You think of noble houses where tapestries hung thick on walls, blocking draughts, while beds were layered with velvet, silk, and imported furs. Compared to that, your rags seem pitiful. Yet nobles too complained of the cold, their stone chambers more frigid than a peasant's smoky hut. Rich or poor, no one truly escaped the bite of medieval winter. The difference lay only in the softness of what you wrapped yourself in. The pig beside you stirs, snorting, and your blanket slips again. You clutch it fiercely, unwilling to lose the one barrier you have against the frost. The goat noses at a corner, curious, and you swat it away. Even animals know the value of cloth in this cold. You smile wryly at the thought of defending your blanket from a goat in the middle of the night. A child rolls closer, pressing against your side, and you instinctively share the covering. That is how it worked. One blanket stretched across many bodies, each tugging, each yielding, warmth distributed unevenly but at least shared. In those moments, survival was a group negotiation, stitched as tightly as the seams on your ragged quilt. Outside, the wind moans, rattling the wooden latch on the door. Snow drifts pile silently against the threshold. But inside, under patched wool and smoke-soaked furs, you endure. You scratch at a seam, smell the mutton fat again, and settle deeper into the straw. The blanket scratches, the air bites, but the warmth gathers, and that is enough. And you can't help but wonder, drifting toward uneasy dreams, if peasants ever imagined beds of down feathers, crisp linen, or heated rooms. Perhaps they did. Or perhaps, after endless winters, they accepted that patched rags and stubborn wool were not failure but family, the threadbare comfort that kept them alive. The fire is nothing now but a dull red glow, swallowed by ash, and you notice how quickly the chill creeps back in. You instinctively shift closer to the hearth, though it barely gives off more than a suggestion of warmth. Your eyes follow the slow curl of smoke that refuses to leave, trapped beneath the rafters, drifting like a ghost above the room. You cough into your sleeve, and it dawns on you that this smoky hearth is both your greatest comfort and your constant enemy. Evidence from excavated cottages shows hearths positioned right in the middle of the floor, with no chimney, only a hole in the roof or wall. The idea of a controlled fireplace, neatly framed with bricks and flue, was a luxury most peasants never knew. Instead, the fire smouldered low and smoky, often filling the house until beams were coated black. Archaeologists can still see this centuries later, the soot preserved on timbers like fingerprints of survival. The embers you watch are all that remain of logs carefully rationed. Firewood was never endless. In fact, written complaints from medieval manor rolls reveal fines for peasants who gathered wood illegally from a lord's forest. Timber rights were tightly controlled, so every branch burned in your hearth was precious. You understand why the fire is allowed to die to embers stretching fuel through a long winter night demanded discipline. One peculiar story appears in folk traditions. Some families banked their embers under ash before bed, covering them carefully so the coals would smoulder until morning. They called it sleeping fire. In the morning, they stirred it awake again with dry twigs, coaxing life back into it without striking flint. Imagine the relief of seeing those faint red sparks still alive at dawn. Tonight, you crouch closer, nudging the ashes with a stick, and you can see why people treated fire almost like a living companion. But the reality was grim. The smoke stings your eyes, making them water constantly. It lodges in your throat, scratching like grit. Records from medieval physicians describe chronic coughs, catarrh, and other ailments that we would now recognize as smoke inhalation damage. Some experts today argue that constant exposure inside these huts shortened lifespans, especially for women and children who spent more hours indoors. Others suggest that the smoke, ironically, had some benefits. It fumigated the home, discouraging insects and even slowing rot in the thatch. The academic debate continues, but you don't need data to tell you this is choking. You squint through tears, imagining what years of this would do to your lungs. The fire was never just for heat. It cooked every meal, boiled every brew, lit every dark hour. Without it, you had nothing. Families guarded their embers like treasure. In fact, there are accounts of neighbors borrowing live coals from each other, carrying them in clay pots through the night if their own fire died. Matches did not exist. Flint and steel could be fickle. So to lose the hearth meant panic. Picture yourself stumbling to a neighbor's door in the snow, clutching an earthenware jar, praying they still had a coal glowing inside. A curious little detail from some villages. Children were told to whisper charms to the embers before bed, asking the fire to sleep well and wake bright. Whether superstition or comfort, the ritual framed the hearth as part of the family. Listening to the faint hiss of smoke and the occasional pop of wood, you can see how such intimacy with fire was natural. You stretch your hands toward the glow. The heat is weak, but even the illusion soothes you. The orange light throws shadows across the walls, strange shapes that look almost alive. You think of all the winter nights when peasants sat in silence, watching the same shifting glow, letting their minds wander. Maybe they told stories in low voices, or muttered prayers, or just stared until sleep claimed them. And yet, the hearth was dangerous. Sparks sometimes leapt onto straw, or rushes spread across the floor, and huts could ignite within minutes. Whole villages were at risk because each home was a box of tinder. Medieval regulations in towns often ordered fires banked or extinguished at night. For this reason, the very origin of the word curfew, from couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. In rural huts, though, no one enforced it. You slept trusting embers not to betray you. The pig snorts from across the room, startled by a crack of the fire. A child stirs, rubbing his eyes, then rolls closer to the warmth. You tuck the blanket higher around your shoulders and breathe shallowly to avoid the smoke. The hearth may be fading, but its role is clear. It is the fragile heart of this one-room world. Fragile and fickle, but indispensable. You imagine waking at dawn, stirring the embers with iron tongs, adding twigs, coaxing flame. The family would gather for porridge or bread, all made possible by this tiny survival engine. Without it, there would be no cooked food, no safe drink, no warmth at all. You realize how much trust was placed in such a precarious thing. Experts remain divided over whether medieval peasants truly saw the fire as sacred or simply as necessary. Some anthropologists argue that the rituals, prayers, and charms prove reverence. Others caution that practical need often explains what looks like worship. As you sit here, gazing into the glow, you sense both. The fire was necessity, but it was also mystery alive, dangerous, comforting, and feared. The embers pulse faintly, and you know they'll be gone by morning unless carefully tended. You lie back down, feeling the smoky warmth fade across your skin, and listen to the soft breath of family and animals. The hearth is no roaring blaze, no noble fireplace, but in this peasant hut it is enough to keep you tethered to life through another night. You cough once more, eyes stinging, and drift into a half-sleep, where the glow of the hearth is the last image you carry, a fragile ember in a winter without mercy. You stir in the straw, the smoke still clinging to your lungs, and suddenly you notice something odd about the air. It feels damp, heavy, and strangely warm in patches, though the fire has all but died. You breathe in deeply and realize what makes the difference. It is the heat of the people and animals around you, rising in faint clouds that collect beneath the rafters. You tilt your head and catch the sight of condensation glittering on the beams above, like beads of ice waiting to fall. In a world without insulation, the warmth of bodies was both comfort and curse. Medieval observers often described cottages in winter as sweating, the walls dripping with moisture from human breath. Archaeologists studying preserved timbers have even found mineral traces left by centuries of condensation. Imagine dozens of lungs exhaling in a single small room, all night long. The air grows steamy, then cold droplets rain back down. You pull the blanket higher, trying to dodge the drip from above, but there is no real escape. From contemporary accounts, we know this problem was nearly universal. Peasants couldn't afford glass windows, and their huts were poorly ventilated. When too many bodies shared the same space, the atmosphere turned humid and oppressive. Chroniclers noted children waking with damp hair, even though the outside world was frozen stiff. You, lying here with your scalp wet from a rafter's drip, can almost feel the chill creeping under your skin. One odd little image survives in folklore. People joked that if you left bread dough near the bed, the steam from sleepers' breath could almost help it rise. Was it true? Hardly. But the exaggeration speaks to just how stifling the air became. You chuckle softly at the thought, your night of restless sleep doubling as a primitive bakery. Yet the effect wasn't always humorous. Moisture encouraged mold. Straw bedding soaked it up, turning musty. Coughs deepened into infections. Some modern researchers argue that this cycle, dampness, chill, and crowding, was a key reason winter was the deadliest season for peasants. Others counter that peasants, accustomed to such conditions, developed resilience we underestimate. The scholarly debate remains unresolved, but as you wipe a cold drip from your forehead, you sense the danger yourself. Your ears pick up the subtle chorus of sound, snoring, wheezing, the whistle of someone's congested nose. You realize that you are breathing not fresh night air, but the recycled output of dozens of lungs. Each sigh carries warmth, but also germs. In this tiny space, no cough goes unnoticed. The old man's hacking rattles through the room again, and you understand why sickness spread like fire in winter huts. Still, there was an undeniable upside. That mingled breath created a microclimate of sorts, a thin layer of warmth that softened the edge of frost. You rub your hands together, noticing that your fingers, while cold, are not frozen stiff. Without that haze of shared exhalation, you might already be numb. In its own clammy way, the breath of your companions keeps you alive. Children squirm in their sleep, their cheeks rosy from the damp heat. A pig snorts, exhaling a gust of steam that mingles with your own. For a moment, the room feels alive in a strangely unified way, as though the whole family, human and beast alike, share one great lung. You listen to it, the rise and fall, the condensation dripping back down like rain, and you wonder if medieval people noticed this too. Perhaps they spoke of the hut breathing. Perhaps they joked, or perhaps they cursed it. We can't know for sure. There's another curious practice worth mentioning. In some regions, peasants deliberately hung cloths from rafters to catch the drips. A soaked rag was easier to wring out than a damp blanket. Imagine stretching a sheet overhead, a primitive ceiling liner, so that icy droplets fell into it instead of onto your face. Ingenious, if not elegant. You glance upward and wish the family you're visiting tonight had tried the same. But even the best tricks couldn't mask the reality. Nights were long, air was heavy, and the body was both furnace and fog machine. The mingling of breath built bonds, yes, but also blurred boundaries. You think of how strange it would feel today to inhale the warmth of your neighbors night after night. Yet, for them, it was natural, unquestioned. Survival demanded it. Experts remain divided over how peasants perceived such conditions. Did they grumble about the damp, or did they simply ignore it as inevitable? Some accounts suggest irritation complaints of dripping houses appear in folk sayings. Others imply indifference, as though no one considered dryness a possibility. The truth, as so often, lies somewhere in the haze. A droplet finally lands on your cheek, startling you awake again. You swipe it away, half amused, half annoyed. The child beside you mumbles something unintelligible and pulls closer. You sigh, allowing the warmth of shared breath to soothe you despite the discomfort. The rafters above creak under snow, water drips steadily, and the invisible cloud of air pulses around you like the hut's own heartbeat. You close your eyes, telling yourself that the morning will bring fresh air, even if it's bitterly cold. For now, though, you drift inside this steaming cocoon, where every breath joins another, where warmth and sickness travel alike, and where life persists in the fog of a shared winter night. You stir awake, shivering. The blanket has slipped, and a draught snakes along your legs like icy fingers. You grope in the dark, following the cold to its source, and soon discover the culprit, the window. Calling it a window feels generous. It's no glass pane, just a hole cut into the wall, barely larger than your head. Tonight, someone has stuffed it with rags and bits of wood, but the wind has found its way through the gaps. Each gust carries a whistle, faint but sharp, and you suddenly realize how much of the night is shaped by the struggle against drafts. From preserved cottages across Europe, archaeologists confirm that most peasants never saw glass in their lifetimes. A few wealthier homes used animal horns scraped thin or oiled parchment, translucent enough to admit light, but those were luxuries. The majority of villagers endured winter with openings blocked by shutters, boards, or simple cloth. Light was sacrificed for warmth. You picture how, by day, the interior must have been nearly cave dark, all to stop the endless assault of wind. You reach out and touch the rags wedged into the frame. They are damp, stiff with frost, and when you press them, you feel the air seeping through. Families did what they could, shoving moss, straw, or even manure into cracks to plug them. A 15th century household account mentions winter cloths, specifically set aside for windows, ragged bits reserved for draft, fighting rather than daily wear. You almost laugh at the idea of a wardrobe for plugging holes. But tonight, feeling the icy fingers against your calves, you understand. One amusing little note from folklore claims villagers sometimes used fish bladders as makeshift window coverings. Stretched and dried, they were translucent enough to admit a dull glow while blocking wind. Imagine going to bed with herring skin windows, unlikely to smell pleasant, but resourceful nonetheless. The child beside you whimpers in his sleep, clutching your arm, and you instinctively shift so your body shields him from the draft. That was part of survival, too, blocking one another from the cold, creating human barricades against the air. Sleeping positions weren't just about comfort, they were tactics. Grandparents often bore the edges, children tucked into the middle, and adults shifted as needed. The rags in the window may fail, but the family wall holds. Academic opinion remains divided on how effective these draft-proofing methods really were. Some scholars argue that the effort was symbolic, providing psychological comfort more than physical relief. Others suggest that even small reductions in airflow could mean the difference between frostbite and endurance. The truth is hard to measure from centuries away, but as you huddle here, every little scrap of cloth feels vital. The wind sighs again, rattling the frame. You imagine long winter nights filled with that sound, the endless moaning of wind through imperfect seams. Medieval literature sometimes personified it, the wind that sings through the walls, as one English ballad puts it. You listen, and indeed it does sound like a song, eerie and thin, rising and falling with each gust. Perhaps peasants found rhythm in it, a lullaby they never chose but learned to live with. You think of noble houses with their leaded glass, expensive and fragile, glowing with candlelight behind coloured panes. Compared to this ragged hole, those chambers must have seemed magical. Yet even nobles complained of draughts sneaking around their tapestries. No one in this age was free from winter's intrusion. For peasants, though, there was no buffer. The wind slept in the same room as you, uninvited and unrelenting. The rags shift again, and this time snowflakes blow in, melting instantly on your blanket. You brush them off, teeth chattering. Someone across the room stirs, curses softly, and wedges another plank against the frame. The sound of hammering echoes briefly, then fades, swallowed by the night. Temporary solutions always temporary. Tomorrow, more snow, more wind, more scrambling for scraps to shove into gaps. There's a strange intimacy in it. Every object in the house, from broken tunic to leftover straw, can become part of this battle against cold. Nothing wasted. You imagine children tasked with gathering moss to stuff into holes, mothers patching cloth, fathers trimming boards. Draft-proofing wasn't a one-time job. It was constant maintenance, as essential as tending animals or stirring embers. A drop of melted snow lands on your forehead, sending a shiver down your spine. You roll to face away from the window, pressing closer to the mass of sleeping bodies. The goat at your feet shifts, blocking some of the draft. You sigh in relief, silently thanking an animal you once swatted away. The whistle continues, though softer now, dulled by the extra plank. You let it blend into the background, a reminder that the hut is porous, that nature always finds a way in. And perhaps that was part of the medieval mindset too. Not conquering winter, but enduring it patch by patch, night by night. Your eyes close again, lulled by the faint sigh of wind and the warmth of bodies. The rags in the window may never hold perfectly, but they hold enough. And enough, in this world, is survival. You shift beneath the patchwork blanket, and something scratches against your neck. It isn't straw this time, it's wool. Thick, coarse and unwashed, it scratches like sandpaper, but you tug it tighter anyway. In the medieval world, what you wear to bed is rarely different from what you wear during the day. The tunic you pull over your head in the morning is the same one you curl into at night. Pajamas, as you know them, do not exist. From monastic records and wills, we know that the basic garment for peasants was the woolen tunic knee-length for men, longer for women. It was often their only major piece of clothing. When it grew too thin, they patched it. When it tore, they layered another rag beneath. At night, peasants simply kept the tunic on, perhaps wrapping a cloak or extra shirt around themselves if they owned one. In colder regions, a hood or coif covered the head, since so much body heat escapes there. You run your fingers over the edge of your hood now, grateful for the rough fabric, even as it prickles against your skin. A peculiar practice, described in some later accounts, was to stuff straw into socks or shoes as insulation. Imagine going to bed with little straw bundles wrapped around your feet. It was not comfortable, but it blunted the chill. Tonight, your toes ache with cold, and you almost wish someone would hand you a bundle of hay to try it. Researchers continue to disagree about how layered peasant clothing truly was in winter. Some argue that people wore multiple tunics at once, shedding them only in summer. Others think that the poor simply lacked enough textiles to do so. The evidence varies by region. Scandinavian finds show thicker, layered wool, while English peasant wills often list only a single tunic. You, lying here scratching at the itchy fabric, suspect the truth was uneven. Some households had options, others had only one set of clothes from birth to burial. You lift your arm and sniff. The smell is pungent, sweat, smoke, and lanolin from the wool itself. Washing clothes was difficult in winter, when water froze and drying took days. More often, people brushed dirt off, or smoked garments over the hearth to kill lice. Your tunic carries the scent of every fire you've sat beside, every day's labor in fields and stables. It is a history written in odor, one you carry even to bed. There is an odd little tidbit from a 15th century English household guide. It advised that children sleep clad in their smocks, the simple linen undergarments, to preserve woolens from wear. That suggests that when possible, people valued their outer layers enough to remove them at night. But linen was cooler, and in freezing huts practicality often won. Tonight, you cling to wool despite the itching, because the idea of stripping down is laughable. Your mind wanders to noble chambers again, where fine linen nightshirts and even fur-lined gowns existed. Some aristocrats wore caps to bed, decorated with embroidery. The contrast is sharp. While you itch in coarse wool, nobles complained of silk being too slippery on feather mattresses. Yet despite the difference, both rich and poor feared the same enemy, the cold. The child curled beside you wears a smaller version of the same tunic, patched at the elbows. His hair smells of smoke, and his breath is hot against your chest. You tug your cloak over him as well, sacrificing your own comfort for his. That, too, was part of the nightly ritual, redistributing what little clothing and coverings existed so that the weakest survived. Parents often bore more of the cold so children could live. Experts are still divided on whether peasants ever designated night clothes distinct from day wear. Some argue that poorer villagers must have, at least occasionally, removed outer garments for sleep, otherwise the rapid wear on wool would be unsustainable. Others counter that survival trumped preservation, and that most simply lived, worked, and slept in the same outfit until it rotted away. Listening to the crackle of the dying hearth, you lean toward the second view. Warmth mattered more than fabric longevity when frost threatened your toes. You scratch at your sleeve again, wincing at the coarseness. It's hard to imagine calling this itchy tunic a comfort, yet in the bleakness of winter nights, it was precious. Wool's scratch may irritate, but it insulates even when damp, clings to heat, and endures for years. You realize that every thread against your skin is a small shield in the long battle against winter. The goat shifts near your feet, nudging at your rough-clad legs. You chuckle quietly. At least animals didn't complain about the fabric, they grew their own coats. You close your eyes, wrapping the cloak tighter, and let the itch fade into background noise. Perhaps peasants never dreamed of pajamas. Perhaps they accepted that sleep was never about softness or comfort, only endurance. And as you drift back towards slumber, you think, scratchy though it is, this tunic is the line between you and the frost that rattles at the door. Your body stirs again, restless in the straw. This time the cold does not come from a draft or the blanket slipping. It comes from the inevitable fact that you are pressed so tightly among others that every position feels temporary. Someone's elbow digs into your ribs. A child's foot has found your stomach. You wiggle, trying to claim a patch of space, but as soon as you move, another body follows. It is a strange dance, half unconscious, half deliberate, performed in the darkness of every medieval hut, the shifting choreography of sleep. Historical sources occasionally describe communal sleeping formations. In some households, people deliberately curled into spoon-like chains, each back pressed to the next, so that heat passed along the line. It is easy to imagine the rhythm of it. One turns, and the whole chain rolls like a tide. In other families, sleepers arrange themselves in a huddle, feet toward the fire, heads toward the wall, forming a circle of warmth. Archaeologists studying soot patterns on floors have suggested that such arrangements left imprints in straw bedding. You, lying here in a cramped heap, can almost see the geometry of survival drawn into the very ground. One peculiar reference comes from a 14th century French manuscript describing peasants turning like oxen yoked in a field. It sounds mocking, but you recognize the truth of it. There is a rhythm in this bed, and you cannot ignore it. The child beside you stirs. You shift to make space. The old man wheezes, and someone props him against the wall. A goat pushes closer, and everyone adjusts around its bulk. Sleep is not static. It is movement shared. And yet, it is not random. Families developed rules, whether spoken or not. Younger children belonged in the middle, elders at the edges, parents between to anchor them. Sometimes, to maximize warmth, people lay head to foot, creating a patchwork of limbs where no one's chest was left bare to the air. Try as you might to carve out privacy, you end up a piece in a larger puzzle. Modern scholars still disagree about how carefully such sleeping patterns were planned. Some suggest they were routine, a nightly strategy for warmth. Others argue that people simply collapsed into heaps after exhausting days, order only forming from habit. The evidence is frustratingly thin. Beds rarely preserve their secrets, but you suspect both are true. Strategies existed, but exhaustion often dictated the final shape. The quirkier side of these arrangements appears in songs and jokes. One ballad teases a husband for ending up beside the sow after his wife claimed the warm middle. Another proverb warns, "He who sleeps at the edge wakes with the frost," a reminder that the unlucky sleeper against the wall often froze. Tonight, you can sympathize. Your shoulder grazes the mud-plastered wall, and frost nips your skin like tiny teeth. You shuffle quickly toward the middle, unapologetic, because the difference between center and edge is the difference between shivers and warmth. Still, there was tension. Imagine spending every night crushed between relatives, overhearing snores, feeling their sweat, smelling their breath. Boundaries blur. Embarrassments become common. A sneeze lands on your face. A cousin mutters in his dreams. The pig shifts and rolls against your legs. At first it feels unbearable, then strangely normal, as though your body accepts the chaos because there is no alternative. You recall how monastic dormitories arranged monks in rows, each with his own pallet, sometimes separated by low partitions. The contrast is striking, communal, yet orderly, designed to suppress bodily chaos. In a peasant hut, though, there is no order beyond necessity. The structure is looser, the intimacy greater, the discomfort more frequent. Yet both systems share one truth: people rarely slept alone. Solitude in the medieval night was a rarity, perhaps even a danger. As the night deepens, the movements continue. Someone in the chain rolls over, pulling the blanket with them. A chorus of groans follows. You hear muttered negotiations. "Give it back. I'm cold. Move your feet." Then a shuffle, a sigh, and uneasy truce. The next cycle will begin in minutes. It dawns on you that sleep here is less about rest and more about endurance. People do not seek perfect stillness. They seek to make it through until dawn. The body accepts interruptions, adjusts to noise, tolerates elbows. What would break your patience after one night was, for them, a lifetime routine. Experts remain divided on whether this constant shifting damaged sleep quality. Some argue peasants must have been chronically sleep-deprived, their nights fractured by movement and noise. Others counter that human bodies may adapt, entering deep rest despite disturbance. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Peasants likely experienced lighter, more broken sleep, but compensated with segmented rest, naps, and resilience forged by necessity. The chain shifts again. This time, you are caught in the middle, pressed by heat on all sides. Sweat beads on your brow even as your toes stay icy. You sigh, realizing how little control you have. Yet there is also a strange comfort. To be part of this restless tide, moving with family and animals alike, is to share the burden of survival. No one escapes the discomfort. Everyone endures it together. A faint whistle of wind sneaks through the patched window. A drop of condensation lands on your cheek. The old man coughs. The goat snores. You turn once more, elbow grazing someone's back, and the entire heap responds like a single organism. Perhaps, you think drowsily, this was the true lesson of medieval nights, that comfort was secondary to solidarity. Sleep was not your own, but shared. Every turn of the body, every tug of the blanket, every sigh in the dark was part of a larger rhythm, and in that rhythm, however awkward, there was life. You jolt awake, though you aren't sure why. The hut is hushed, except for the snoring chorus of bodies and beasts. Then you notice it. The embers in the hearth have collapsed into blackness. The faint orange glow is gone. A deep cold seeps into the room, sliding across the floor like a fog. Someone rises quietly, careful not to step on children, and you realize it is their turn to tend the fire. Medieval nights were rarely uninterrupted. The midnight watch, as some villagers called it, was a necessity. Fires needed coaxing, animals needed checking, and predators lurked outside. Even inside, a family might designate who would rise halfway through the night to poke the embers, feed the goats, or listen for trouble. A household without such vigilance risked waking to frozen water, stiff limbs, or a cow gone missing. You watch as the figure crouches near the hearth, blowing softly on the ash. A faint glow stirs back to life, and with a few twigs, a lick of flame emerges. The sound of crackling fills the silence, and for a moment, the room breathes easier. The man adds a log carefully, since firewood is scarce, then sits back, staring into the tiny blaze. His face is gaunt, lit by orange light, and you sense the weight of responsibility. Contemporary accounts sometimes mention this broken rhythm of sleep. Peasants lived by tasks, not clocks. Someone always needed to stir. Some historians argue that this vigilance became habitual, dividing nights into segments of wakefulness and slumber. Others maintain that the interruptions were irregular, born of necessity rather than ritual. The debate continues, but what is clear is that uninterrupted 8-hour sleep was a modern luxury, not a medieval reality. A curious little anecdote appears in a 15th century German chronicle. A villager rose at midnight to check on animals and discovered a thief crouching by the door, attempting to drag away a pig. His vigilance saved the family's wealth. Stories like these underline why the midnight watch mattered. Tonight, as you watch the man sit silently by the hearth, you imagine how many such stories went untold, lives saved, disasters avoided, simply because someone woke at the right time. He doesn't return to bed immediately. Instead, he sits with elbows on knees, staring into the flames. This too was part of the rhythm. Night was long, longer than modern minds can easily picture, and silence often pressed heavily. People sometimes used the waking hour to think, pray, or mend tools by firelight. Monks in cloisters had official vigils at midnight. Peasants had their own unscheduled ones. You wonder how many thoughts, how many whispered prayers, were poured into embers across centuries. The animals stir as he moves. The cow shifts, letting out a low sigh. The pig grunts. He rises to check their pen, stepping carefully to avoid children sprawled in straw. The cold outside must be brutal. His breath fogs even inside the hut. Yet he opens the door a crack, peers out, then closes it again quickly. The draft sweeps in like a blade, making you curl under the blanket. He mutters something, satisfied perhaps that the snow hasn't blocked the door completely, then returns to the fire. Specialists remain divided over whether peasants rotated these duties formally, or whether mothers, fathers, or elders took the role by habit. Some believe younger adults bore most of the burden, letting children and the very old sleep undisturbed. Others point to evidence that women, nursing infants or tending food, often rose in the night anyway. It is hard to prove one way or another, but you suspect every household found its own rhythm. Tonight, in this family, one man shoulders it. He finally lies back down, tucking himself at the edge of the bedding. His movements rouse the chain of sleepers, and soon others roll, stretch, and resettle. The cycle continues. Sleep is never absolute. It is layered, broken, shared. You think of your own nights, measured by alarms and routines, and marvel at how foreign this pattern feels, yet how natural it must have been when darkness stretched for 14 hours. One detail worth noting is that people sometimes used the midnight watch for tasks we would consider daytime work. A woman might spin a bit of wool, a man might repair a tool, both illuminated by the small flame. These odd pockets of productivity made sense when daylight was short. The night was long, and while much of it was spent trying to stay warm, fragments could be reclaimed. You picture nimble fingers working silently in the glow, the family snoring around them. The fire brightens, then dims again as it consumes the log, but now it has enough life to last until morning. The watcher sighs, curling back into straw. The air grows still once more. You feel the faint warmth creeping outward, soft as a sigh, and you let it ease you back toward drowsiness. Perhaps this was one of the quietest forms of resilience peasants had, accepting that sleep came in shifts, that someone always bore the weight of wakefulness, and that night was not an enemy to be conquered but a tide to be navigated. You breathe in the smoky air, cough once, and let the fire's faint crackle guide you back into slumber, trusting that when the next watch comes, someone else will rise. You don't know how long you've been asleep when your eyes open again. The fire has burned low, though not completely out, and the hut feels hushed, suspended in a strange middle state. It is neither evening nor morning, but something in between. The bodies around you stir, not in the chaotic restlessness of earlier, but in a quieter rhythm. A woman whispers to a child. Someone mutters a prayer. The old man coughs, then sighs as though relieved to be awake. You realize you are living through what scholars later called the two sleeps. Evidence from medical texts and diaries as late as the 17th century describes how people across Europe commonly divided their nights. They did not expect to sleep in one long stretch. Instead, they drifted into a first sleep after dusk, woke for an hour or two at midnight, then settled into a second sleep until dawn. In that middle span, they prayed, talked, tended fires, checked animals, or even visited neighbors. To them, it was normal. To you, accustomed to forcing 8 hours in one block, it feels strange but oddly peaceful. You sit up slowly, rubbing your eyes. The hut is dim, but not entirely dark. The embers still paint everything in faint red. The silence is softer now, filled with small murmurs. A boy asks his mother if spring will come soon. She answers with a story about St. Martin's cloak, spun quietly as though it belongs only to the night. The child listens, yawns, and drifts back down. You realize this interval is not just practical, it is also cultural. Families filled it with tales, prayers, or simply shared breath. One curious note from court records mentions that villagers sometimes met in the streets during this middle wakefulness. Imagine stepping outside into frozen air, seeing lanterns glow in other doorways, and trading words with neighbors before returning to bed. The idea seems almost surreal, night as a communal pause rather than a barrier. Yet it happened often enough to be remarked upon. Experts remain split on whether peasants in all regions observed segmented sleep, or whether it was more common in certain climates and cultures. Some argue that only literate classes recorded the habit, so the practice among peasants is harder to prove. Others counter that physical evidence of broken rest, the need to tend fires, animals, and children, makes it nearly inevitable. As you listen to the whispers in this hut, you feel the practice in your bones. It is not exotic, it is natural. A peculiar anecdote from a 15th century French medical guide recommended using the time between first and second sleep for intimacy, suggesting couples found the pause ideal. You chuckle softly, though you realize that in a crowded bed with half the household present, such privacy would be unlikely. Still, the idea reveals how normal the midnight interval was, woven even into advice on health. You lie back, staring at the rafters where condensation still glistens. Your mind drifts more easily in this half-wakefulness. Perhaps this was part of its function, a mental space between day and deep sleep. People prayed, reflected, even planned tasks for the coming daylight. In an age with so little artificial light, the body followed a rhythm the dark demanded. You can almost feel your thoughts stretch, looser than in daytime, as though the night gives permission for wandering. The pig grunts in its sleep, the goat shifts, and a child whispers another question into the dark. This time it's about angels. His mother hums softly, no full answer given. The sound blurs with the crackle of coals, and you realize this interval is not just practical, it is intimate, a seam of connection hidden within the fabric of winter nights. You think of modern life, where people force wakefulness late into the night with screens, then fight to compress rest into 8 hours. Here, the dark stretches so long that 2 sleeps seem inevitable. The middle watch is not wasted time but part of the rhythm, as natural as tides. Scholars have long debated whether this segmented pattern faded only with the rise of artificial lighting, or whether social changes gradually pushed people toward longer, consolidated nights. The jury is still out. What is certain is that in huts like this one, in winters long and severe, first and second sleep-shaped daily existence, you sigh, feeling your eyelids grow heavy again. The whispers fade, the embers glow softer. One by one, the family drifts back into second sleep, the rhythm as ancient as the thatch above. You follow, tucking yourself deeper into straw and wool, surrendering to the pull of another dream. And so the night continues, 2 sleeps stitched together, a pause at the heart of darkness, and the quiet endurance of peasants who never questioned that this was simply how life was. Your eyes flutter open again, though this time it is not the cold or a dripping rafter that wakes you. It is the faint smell of something bitter and yeasty, wafting across the room. You shift in the straw and notice one of the older men lifting a small clay cup to his lips. He tips it back, swallows, sighs, and then lies down again with a satisfied grunt. You realize he has been drinking ale, his nightcap, before returning to sleep. For medieval peasants, ale was as ordinary as water. In fact, in many regions, it was safer than water. Brewing killed off some of the harmful bacteria, and even low-strength ale carried enough calories to make it worthwhile. Surviving household accounts from England list ale among the daily provisions, measured by gallons rather than cups. Families brewed their own or bought small quantities from neighbours. It was cheap, filling, and always available. At night, it doubled as comfort. You rub your eyes, watching as the clay cup passes from hand to hand. The liquid inside is cloudy, pale brown, and not strong, perhaps 2% alcohol at most. It is more like liquid bread than a drink in the modern sense. But after a long day and a cold night, it soothes. The warmth in your belly spreads, dulling the edge of hunger. You take a sip yourself and taste sourness mixed with malt, rough but oddly satisfying. A curious little note from brewing records shows that some peasants flavoured their ale with herbs like bog myrtle or rosemary, giving it a sharp, resinous taste. Tonight, you swear you catch a hint of something herbal, though it could just be the smoke from the hearth clinging to the cup. Either way, the drink steadies you, softening the misery of frost and itch. Researchers continue to disagree about whether peasants truly drank ale before bed as a nightly custom, or whether it was more occasional, tied to feasts or heavy workdays. Some argue that evidence of constant consumption shows it was routine. Others point out that grain was too valuable to waste on casual brewing. The truth likely varies from village to village. Yet sitting here, cup in hand, you can see the appeal of a nightly draught. Hunger and cold both fade, if only a little. The child beside you stirs, and a mother dips her finger into the ale, rubbing it across his lips. He smacks once, then drifts back into sleep. It shocks you at first, but then you remember, in a world without clean water or plentiful milk, weak ale was a common drink even for children. It provided calories and warmth, and no one thought twice of it. The atmosphere of the hut shifts with each sip. The old man hums softly, a fragment of a song carried from some festival. Another adult chuckles, muttering a joke too low for you to catch. The bitterness of ale seems to loosen tongues even in this smoky dark. For a moment, the weight of winter lifts. You can see how this simple drink was more than nourishment. It was a balm against despair. One anecdote from medieval folklore even warns that a man who goes to bed without ale dreams of wolves. Was it superstition, or simply a reminder of how central the drink was to their sense of comfort? Tonight, you feel it yourself. Without the faint warmth of ale in your stomach, the cold would press harder. With it, you find yourself settling easier into straw. Still, there are limits. Too much ale, even weak, could disrupt more than it soothed. Court records occasionally mention fights breaking out in villages when alehouses served late, and some priests scolded parishioners for ale-sodden sloth, warning that overindulgence bred sin. Even in private huts, too much drink might spark quarrels between bedfellows. But here, in this family, the small sip shared quietly does not inflame, it soothes. You shift under the blanket, eyes heavy, feeling the ale's warmth linger. Around you, the hut breathes again in unison, softer now, as though the drink has lulled everyone into calmer rhythms. Even the pig seems to sigh with contentment, curling tighter against the straw. Perhaps, you think, ale was not only about safety and sustenance. Perhaps it was also about ritual, a way of closing the day, marking the pause between wakefulness and second sleep. A sip to dull hunger, a swallow to quiet thoughts, a warmth to carry into dreams. You nestle deeper, blanket scratching your chin, and close your eyes once more. The faint taste of sour malt lingers on your tongue. Outside, the wind howls. Inside you drift, steadied by the oldest nightcap peasants knew. You wake with a start, scratching at your arm. The itching is insistent, sharp, and maddening. You sit up in the straw, brushing at your sleeve, but the sensation only grows worse. It dawns on you, groggily, that this is no phantom feeling, this is life with bedbugs, lice, and fleas, the nightly companions of peasants across Europe. Medieval writings, including sermons and household manuals, speak of vermin in the bed, as though it were an unremarkable fact of life. Archaeologists have even found fossilized flea remains in layers of straw bedding, their tiny shells preserved like grim souvenirs. You scratch again and realize how constant this irritation must have been, never fully absent, always waiting in the dark. One detail we know from surviving remedies is that people fought back with herbs. Families burned bundles of wormwood, tansy, or pennyroyal in the hearth, letting the smoke drift through bedding. Supposedly, the scent drove pests away. You glance at the rafters, where a bunch of dried leaves hangs, releasing a faint, bitter smell into the air. It is not perfume, it is pest control. Whether it truly worked is uncertain. Some historians argue it offered little more than psychological comfort, while others suggest that strong oils in the plants did repel insects to a degree. Tonight, though, you still scratch. There's a curious little tidbit recorded in a German household guide. One suggestion was to scatter ashes into the straw, creating a texture fleas disliked. Imagine lying down in bedding dusted with soot. The thought makes you wrinkle your nose, yet desperate times called for desperate measures. Your fellow sleepers stir as well. A child scratches his scalp, rubbing his head against a blanket. An old woman sighs, muttering that the bugs are lively tonight. This kind of commentary was normal. Vermin were not a shame, but a nuisance endured. Even monasteries and noble houses complained of lice, proving that no rank escaped. Experts remain divided over how devastating infestations truly were. Some argue they were tolerable background noise, something people barely noticed after years of endurance. Others insist they contributed to disease and exhaustion far more than records admit. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, not deadly most nights, but relentless, wearing at health over time. You remember reading that some families smoked their bedding deliberately, hanging straw sacks above the hearth to let the smoke kill off bugs. The result was bedding reeking of fire, but slightly less alive. As you inhale the smoky air here, you wonder if this family has done the same. The smell of scorched straw clings faintly to the blanket. Another remedy, oddly charming, involves sprinkling aromatic seeds like fennel or lavender around bedding. Whether effective or not, it at least offered a sweeter smell to mask the stench of sweat and animals. Tonight you imagine a faint hint of lavender cutting through the barnyard musk, and for a moment the hut almost feels pleasant. You scratch again, nails catching on a seam in your tunic. The itch doesn't stop. You realize this was the true rhythm of medieval nights, not silence, but constant irritation. Families scratched in the dark, adjusting, sighing, accepting. It was never a matter of conquering the bugs, only living with them. One folktale even claimed that fleas were God's reminder of humility, small tormentors to keep humans from pride. Perhaps that belief made the bites more bearable, or perhaps it was just a way to laugh through discomfort. Either way, the bites continued, and so did life. The pig snorts, scratching itself against the wall. You and the animal share the same battle. A child groans, slapping at his legs, then curls tighter into the straw. Eventually, exhaustion wins. You lie back down, still itching but too tired to care. As your eyes close, you think, perhaps resilience is not about victory over pests, but about the stubborn choice to sleep anyway. And so, scratching, sighing, and resigned, you drift once more into uneasy dreams. You shift again in the straw, your skin still prickling from the fleas. The air in the hut feels slightly warmer now, though not because the fire has revived. It is because someone has pulled a sheet across the bed, creating a thin barrier that traps the heat more effectively than before. You blink in the gloom and realize what you're seeing: a makeshift canopy. A single rope strung from one wall to the other, with cloth hanging down, sectioning off part of the sleeping space. For peasants, even the simplest curtain could transform a winter night. Inventories from modest households sometimes list one cloth for the bed, not decorative but practical. A drape, even of rough linen or patched wool, held back drafts and preserved warmth. It also created a shadow of privacy in rooms where dozens of eyes otherwise saw everything. You slide under it now, noticing how quickly the trapped breath thickens the air. There is an odd little anecdote from a 15th century account. One man bragged that his wife sewed a canopy from old tunics, claiming it made their hut as warm as a nobleman's chamber. The boast may have been exaggeration, but the principle was sound. Even thin fabric could act as insulation. Tonight, you can feel the difference. The cold drafts from the window are muted, and the bodies around you seem to radiate warmth more efficiently inside this small enclosure. Specialists still argue about how common such bed curtains were among peasants. Some scholars suggest they were rare luxuries, more typical in wealthier homes, while others believe resourceful families improvised with whatever cloth they could spare. Archaeological finds are scarce, since fabric rarely survives, but the idea itself is simple enough that you suspect many tried it. You shift onto your side, and the fabric brushes your cheek. It smells of smoke and wool grease, hardly pleasant, but it blocks the sight of rafters dripping with condensation. Suddenly the room feels smaller, more contained, more yours. In a space where nothing is private, this scrap of cloth creates a boundary, however thin. You imagine noble households where heavy, embroidered curtains enclosed entire beds, trapping warmth so effectively that sleepers might sweat even in midwinter. Compared to that, your single rope and patched sheet seem meager, yet the principle is identical: fabric as armor against winter. One curious custom noted in some rural villages was hanging a child's christening cloth above the bed for luck. Whether it kept spirits away or merely honored tradition, it added another layer of meaning to the curtain. Bedtime was never just physical, it was threaded with ritual and symbolism. Tonight, you wonder if the family's rope-hung cloth is more than practical. Perhaps it is also a charm. You listen closely. Outside the canopy, you still hear the goat shifting, the pig snorting, the grandfather coughing. But inside, the sound is muffled, as though the fabric creates its own world. Sleep comes easier in this cocoon. Perhaps that was part of the allure too, the illusion of separation, a pocket of stillness inside chaos. Experts remain divided on whether these makeshift canopies truly improved warmth or whether the benefit was more psychological. Some argue that the difference in temperature would have been minor. Others point to modern experiments showing that even thin barriers reduced drafts significantly. The truth is probably a mix. The cloth added a few degrees of comfort and a great deal of peace of mind. You stretch your arm, brushing the fabric again, and you feel its fragility. It could tear easily, and every patch shows years of mending. Yet the care in those stitches speaks volumes. Families invested time into sewing because each scrap of warmth mattered. You picture a mother at dusk, stitching torn cloth by firelight, knowing her work would help the children sleep through another freezing night. The child beside you rolls closer, burrowing into your chest. His breath fogs the air inside the canopy. You tuck the edge of the cloth around both of you, sealing the little tent. For a moment, you feel as though the world outside, wolves, snow, thieves, and endless dark, cannot reach you. You know it's an illusion, but illusions can be powerful. Perhaps this is what peasants sought most on winter nights. Not perfect comfort, which was impossible, but small defenses. A rope with a cloth, a scrap of fur, a shared blanket. None of them solved the cold entirely, but together they made endurance possible. You close your eyes, letting the muffled air wrap around you. The fleas still bite, the smoke still lingers, the wind still sighs at the window. Yet within this patchwork canopy, you feel a fragile sanctuary. And as you drift, you think, maybe luxury was never about gold or velvet, but about the rare gift of sleeping one night without shivering. You sink deeper into the straw, half asleep, when another sound intrudes the noises of the village beyond these smoky walls. At first it is faint, then clearer, a dog barking somewhere down the lane, answered by another farther away. A rooster crows too early, confused by the dim glow of the embers. And from beyond the hut, muffled voices drift in someone staggering home from the alehouse, laughing too loudly. You realize again how thin these walls truly are. Peasant cottages were not built to keep out sound. Wattle and daub was porous, and thatch carried noises as though it were no more than woven grass. Every neighbour's quarrel, every midnight song, every clatter of a bucket rang through. Court records from rural England even mention villagers complaining of night clamours, neighbours shouting or singing too loudly after dark. You hear it now, a man's voice, slurred, trying to keep a tune. His wife scolds him, her sharp tone carrying almost as clearly as if she stood in this very room. One curious detail from folk tales is that people used the barking of dogs as an informal clock. If the dogs raised a chorus, it often meant strangers were passing or animals prowled. Tonight, the dog's restless calls suggest both. You imagine foxes near the henhouse or perhaps a thief skulking along the fence. The family stirs uneasily. Everyone listens. In the dark, even distant noises feel threatening. Scholars remain divided on whether rural villages were truly quiet places or surprisingly noisy ones. Some argue that without modern industry, the nights must have been hushed, filled only with natural sounds. Others counter that close living, animals, and communal life made villages perpetually loud. The truth may be both. Silence in the fields, clamour in the lanes. For you, lying here in this hut, the clamour is undeniable. The pig beside you grunts in response to the outside noises. The goat lifts its head, ears twitching, then settles back down. A child murmurs, asking if wolves are near. His mother whispers back that it is only neighbours, too full of ale. The reassurance is calm, though you notice her hand tightens on the blanket, as if to keep everyone closer. One odd little anecdote preserved in a collection of medieval proverbs says, "The walls have ears, and the roof has a tongue. The phrase captured how cottages never kept secrets, every whisper might be overheard, every sound carried outward. Tonight you hear the truth of it. When the drunken singer trips and curses, the whole lane seems to laugh, the noise rippling like water through the village. You shift under your canopy and think about how little privacy existed, not only inside the hut but outside as well. Everyone knew when a family argued, when a cow calved, when a child cried at night. The noises of one house were the noises of all. Perhaps this bred community, binding people through constant awareness. Or perhaps it bred resentment, each household irritated by the other. Historians still debate whether this proximity fostered harmony or constant friction. You suspect it did both. The rooster crows again, stubborn and insistent. Someone outside hurls a stone, shouting for silence. The bird pauses, then crows anyway, triumphant. You chuckle softly into the blanket, realizing that even centuries ago, the battle between humans and noisy roosters was eternal. The dogs grow quieter, their barking turning to occasional growls. The lane falls mostly silent, though the drunk man's snores now echo faintly from his own doorstep. You imagine him collapsing outside rather than making it indoors, and you wonder if his wife will leave him there until morning. Inside the hut, the family settles again. The child's question about wolves lingers in your mind. In truth, danger did exist beyond those walls. Wolves, thieves, even raiders in harsher times. But often, the louder menace came from fellow villagers returning from feasts. Medieval nights were not just cold, they were unpredictable, punctured by the sounds of human folly. You turn on your side, straw crunching beneath you, and let the muffled noises wash over. Every bark, every crow, every drunken song reminds you that this hut is not isolated but woven into a living village. The walls may be thin, but so too are the lines between lives. Perhaps, you think drowsily, this was both curse and comfort, to never sleep in true silence, but also never sleep alone. The village was always present, humming even in the dead of night, reminding you that survival was shared. The rooster crows once more, defiant. You sigh, pull the blanket tighter, and let exhaustion drag you back under, the noisy chorus of medieval night fading into your dreams. You stir as the rooster crows again, but this time it is joined by another sound, a creaking wheel, distant but clear. Somewhere nearby, a cart is being pulled along the frosty lane, its squeal piercing the early dark. You pull the blanket higher, trying to shut it out, but the sound reminds you of something else. Not everyone in the village sleeps like you do. Somewhere, a manor house looms. Its lord and lady are also asleep or perhaps awake, yet their nights are shaped by a very different sort of bed. Manorial records and surviving furniture show that wealthier peasants lived in cottages with at least 2 rooms, sometimes even an upper loft. Their beds might be framed in wood, rather than just straw on the floor, and covered with linen sheets and wool blankets. But the real contrast came when you looked up the social ladder to the manor itself. There, carved oak bedsteads stood in chambers hung with tapestries, layered with mattresses stuffed with feathers, hemp, or down. Compared to your scratchy straw sack, such beds seemed unimaginable. And yet, even in those lofty chambers, comfort was not guaranteed. Stone walls radiated cold like a cellar. Draughts slipped past shutters. Fires in great halls warmed only those close enough to the hearth. Some noble accounts even complain of frost forming inside, despite the luxury. You almost smile at the irony. A lord might sleep under silk sheets, but still wake with his breath clouding in the air. One odd little note appears in a medieval satirical poem. A nobleman is mocked for surrounding himself with 3 mattresses, featherbeds piled high, yet still grumbling that his nose froze at night. The image is comical like a frog on a lily pad stack, but it reveals the truth. Even wealth did not conquer winter. Researchers continue to disagree about how wide the gulf was between peasant and lord when it came to sleep. Some argue that nobles truly enjoyed far greater comfort. while others emphasize that cold was the great equalizer. Both views hold merit. Tonight, as you scratch your flea bites in a smoky hut, you admit you'd rather try the feather bed, but you take comfort in knowing that, somewhere in that drafty manor, a noble is also sneezing at frost. The differences, though, weren't only physical. Beds themselves symbolize status. In wills, noble bedsteads were listed as prized heirlooms, sometimes passed down generations. Peasants rarely mentioned theirs at all. Straw was too temporary to count as wealth. Where you endure lumps and vermin, nobles displayed carved posts, embroidered hangings, even locks on their bedchambers. Sleep was not just necessity, it was performance of power. You imagine slipping into such a room now. Tapestries on walls, candles burning low, fur-lined covers heavy as armor. Would it feel warmer than this smoky hut? Perhaps. But would it feel safer? Not necessarily. Records of thefts show that even manors were raided, their silks and feathers stolen. Riches drew danger, while poverty's only defense was that it offered nothing worth stealing. Another peculiar tradition of the wealthy was the tester bed, with curtains pulled tightly around the frame. This cocoon trapped warmth, muffled sound, and kept drafts at bay. For peasants, the closest equivalent was the rope-strung cloth you tugged over earlier. The difference was one of degree, not kind. Both poor and rich longed for the same thing, a barrier against winter. Scholars remain split on whether peasants envied noble comfort or accepted their lot with resignation. Some argue envy must have been fierce. Others point to folk tales in which rich sleepers are mocked for laziness, suggesting admiration was mixed with disdain. Perhaps the truth was complex envy, softened by humor, bitterness leavened with acceptance. The cartwheel creaks again outside, and you picture servants already rising at the manor to stoke fires. Their lords may wake later, stretching in featherbeds, but the work of maintaining even luxury never stopped. Sleep was never entirely private. It relied on others. Servants tended fires, beat mattresses, fetched warm stones to tuck under covers. You realize, with a wry smile, that in some ways the peasant's smoky hut was more honest. You made do with what you had. No illusions. The rooster crows once more, the sound carrying across both cottage and manor alike. In that moment you see the symmetry. Rich or poor, everyone was roused by the same bird, chilled by the same wind, threatened by the same winter. The gulf between straw and feather was real, but not infinite. Both huts and halls echoed with coughs, snores, and muttered prayers for morning. You settle back into your straw, scratching absently. Maybe comfort was relative. A lord cursed his icy nose. You cursed your flea bites. Both endured, waiting for dawn. And perhaps you think sleep itself was the great equalizer. No matter the bedstead, everyone had to close their eyes and trust that another night would pass. Another morning would come. You wake again, this time to the sound of shuffling near the hearth. It is not the family, those familiar shapes still huddle in straw, but strangers. A knock must have come earlier. Hushed voices answered, and now two figures step inside, stamping snow from their boots. Travellers. Their cloaks are stiff with frost, their faces pale in the ember glow. The family makes space without hesitation, lifting the edge of a blanket, gesturing them closer. You blink, surprised, but then realize, in villages like this, hospitality wasn't optional. Written accounts from manorial courts and church registers often mention strangers sharing the same floor, the same straw, sometimes even the same blanket. Roads were rough, inns rare, and nights long. A wanderer caught outside risked death from exposure. Communities knew this, and so doors thinly barred at best often opened to outsiders. It was survival, but also obligation. Refusing shelter could bring shame, and in some regions, fines. The two travellers kneel by the hearth, cupping their hands to the faint coals. Steam rises from their boots as snow melts, filling the hut with a damp smell. The pig grunts uneasily, the goat bleats, but soon both animals settle, recognizing no threat. The The family offers the newcomers a corner of straw, and within minutes they too lie down, cloaks still on, joining the tangled quilt of warmth. One peculiar anecdote appears in a 14th century English chronicle. A beggar was granted shelter in a cottage and later accused of stealing a spoon by dawn. The case ended with fines and gossip, but it illustrates how fragile trust could be. Tonight, you notice how carefully the family tucks their small possessions. A wooden bowl, a knife closer to themselves before closing their eyes again. Generosity, yes, but never naive. Researchers continue to disagree on whether this sharing of space was constant or more occasional. Some argue that rural cottages routinely hosted travelers, while others suggest it was limited to desperate winters. The scarcity of written records leaves gaps. But in the bitter cold of this hut, the logic feels undeniable. Survival often meant sharing, whether you liked it or not. The newcomers shift beside you, their breath clouding the air, merging with the humid fog already thick inside. You feel the weight of their cloaks brushing yours, rough wool crusted with snow. They smell of horse sweat and smoke, unfamiliar yet familiar at once. Every traveler in this world carries the same sense. The child beside you mumbles a question. Are they good men? His mother whispers. All men are God's children on a freezing night. It is an answer more hopeful than certain, but the boy accepts it and drifts back to sleep. You lie awake longer, listening to the subtle sounds of strangers breathing, wondering how many such nights villages endured, safety gambled against compassion. There is a curious little folk belief recorded in parts of Germany. Families were told to welcome guests on winter nights lest Christ himself arrive in disguise. It was not just charity but spiritual insurance. Refusing could mean damnation. You glance at the travellers, their faces softened in sleep, and wonder if peasants saw each guest as both danger and potential blessing. The straw rustles as one of the strangers shifts, pulling the blanket higher. The warmth spreads further through the heap of bodies. In truth, more bodies often meant more comfort. Even suspicion could not outweigh the practical advantage. Perhaps this is why grudges were put aside, why even rivals might share a bed on such nights. Cold killed faster than hatred. Specialists remain split on how peasants felt about such arrangements. Some argue they resented the intrusion, others that they accepted it as the natural order of things. The absence of diaries from the poor makes certainty impossible. Still, as you feel the warmth seep across from these strangers, you suspect gratitude was stronger than resentment when frost rattled the shutters. The hut settles into silence again. Outside, snow piles higher, muting the world. Inside, the family and travelers merge into one breathing organism. You close your eyes, realizing that in this fragile place, survival demanded not walls but willingness to let others in. Perhaps that is the clearest lesson. In the medieval winter night, trust was not an abstract virtue but a tool against death. To sleep beside a stranger was not foolish. It was sometimes the only way to wake again at dawn. The hut is quieter now, but your mind drifts toward another place entirely. You imagine the sound of bells ringing faintly in the distance. Not village bells, but monastery bells. In your half-dreaming state, the smoky straw floor gives way to stone, the chatter of peasants replaced by the measured silence of monks. You find yourself picturing what it would mean to spend a winter's night not in a crowded hut, but in a cloister, where sleep was also a discipline. Accounts from monastic rules, like the Rule of Saint Benedict, describe how monks slept in large dormitories. Rows of narrow pallets stretched across cold stone floors, each monk lying in his own space, often fully clothed. Blankets were thin, wool coarse, and fire scarce. The austerity was deliberate. Comfort was thought to tempt sin. In some orders, monks even slept sitting upright in chairs, a safeguard against drifting into sloth. You shiver at the thought, realizing that even your prickly straw bed feels indulgent compared to such rigors. One intriguing note appears in Cistercian records. Novices were instructed to sleep with a belt on, never removing their clothes. The idea was that vigilance must never slacken, even in rest. They were to be ready to rise for midnight prayers at the ringing of the bell. Tonight, as you imagine lying in such a dormitory, you can hear that bell, thin, metallic, echoing across stone halls. But austerity had its price. Chroniclers complained of frozen ink in scriptoriums and frost forming on monks' blankets. Some suffered chilblains, others lung ailments. Modern scholars argue about whether such extreme denial strengthened faith or simply broke bodies. Some believe monks gained resilience through discipline. Others see only hardship disguised as piety. The evidence offers no single answer, leaving the debate unresolved. Still, the contrast to your smoky hut is striking. In the village, bodies pressed together for warmth. In monasteries, distance and discipline mattered more. Yet both spaces shared the same challenge. Long winter nights without proper insulation. You scratch your arm, then imagine a monk doing the same, cloaked in wool, sitting upright against a wall. One odd little story survives from a Benedictine house in France. Monks supposedly kept their shoes on while sleeping, so they could rise quickly for vigils. The tale may be half exaggeration, but it hints at the constant readiness expected of them. You laugh softly at the idea of trudging into bed with boots still strapped, but perhaps it was true. The air in your vision is colder here. Stone does not hold heat like mud and straw. Drafts slide along corridors, and the sound of chanting lingers even in silence. The difference is that monks chose this life. Where peasants fought cold by necessity, monks embraced it as spiritual training. You wonder which was harder, enduring without choice, or enduring because of devotion. Some researchers suggest that monastic discipline around sleep influenced broader culture. Villagers living near monasteries may have absorbed ideas of segmented nights or nightly prayers. Others argue the influence was minimal, limited to clerical life. As with so much of the medieval world, certainty slips through your fingers like smoke. But tonight, you feel the resonance. Whether in hut or cloister, winter nights carved themselves into the body and soul. Both peasants and monks woke at midnight, though for different reasons, one to stir embers, the other to sing psalms. Both endured cold, though one fought it with goats and pigs, the other with prayer. You blink, and the stone fades. The smoky hut returns, straw prickling your back, animals shifting nearby. Yet you carry the echo of that other world with you, the reminder that sleep in the Middle Ages was never simple, never soft, always shaped by duty, faith, or sheer survival. You sigh, pulling the blanket higher, grateful at least for the warmth of bodies pressed close. Monks may have chosen austerity, but you, here in this hut, are thankful for every goat, pig, and child that shares your heat. Perhaps that is the truest difference. Monks sought holiness in discomfort. Peasants sought life. And in the endless dark of winter, both found what they needed in their own way. You drift in and out of half-dreams until a shiver rattles you awake again. This time, it isn't from the dampness of the straw or the bite of fleas. It's from a vision in your mind, a chamber larger than the entire cottage you've been lying in. The walls are stone, rising high above you. Tapestries hang like giant rugs against the chill, their colours dulled in the darkness. You realize you've left the smoky peasant hut and wandered, at least in imagination, into a castle. It's tempting to think life behind castle walls was pure luxury. Bedsteads carved from oak, mattresses stuffed with feathers, furs layered thick across the body. Surviving inventories from noble households list bedding as lavish as jewelry. Imported linens, velvet covers, ermine, lined sheets. Compared to your straw pallet, it sounds like paradise. But stone, no matter how grand, is colder than mud. Tonight, lying in this imagined chamber, you feel the draughts slipping under the heavy door, seeping between the cracks in shutters, crawling across the floor like invisible serpents. One amusing account from a 14th century French noblewoman complains that she woke to find frost upon the inside of the curtains. Think about that. Even surrounded by silk drapes and heavy furs, her breath still froze. The contrast between splendor and suffering is almost comic. You scratch at your arm, realizing that frost does not care if you wear ermine or wool. Specialists can't quite agree on how effective noble sleeping arrangements were. Some argue that layered hangings and feather beds truly created pockets of comfort. Others emphasize that large, drafty halls made warmth elusive no matter the finery. The evidence supports both. Wealth helped, but winter was stubborn. Still, there were luxuries unimaginable in a peasant hut. Nobles sometimes used bed-warming pans, metal trays filled with embers slid beneath covers to preheat sheets. You picture one now, glowing faintly as a servant slides it carefully under the mattress. The danger of sparks setting linen ablaze was real, yet the practice endured. For peasants, the closest equivalent was a heated brick wrapped in cloth or the warm body of a cow. Both strategies, noble or humble, tell the same story. Nobody liked crawling into icy bedding. One peculiar tidbit comes from Scottish castles, where some households reportedly kept dogs known as comfort hounds, specifically for sleeping at the foot of beds. Their warmth, not their bark, was the real treasure. You imagine a lady of the castle tugging furs around her shoulders, feet pressed against a small, shaggy dog, thankful for its heat. In your smoky hut, you chuckle peasants had pigs and goats, nobles had hounds. Everyone borrowed warmth where they could. The sounds here differ too. Instead of pigs grunting, you hear the muffled groan of timbers and the whistle of wind through arrow slits. Guards tramp on battlements above, their steps echoing down. The cold here feels grander, but no less sharp. You realize that nobles endured noise and restlessness too, only of a different kind. There's debate among historians whether noble families all slept in the same chamber or whether privacy truly separated them. Some records show entire households, children, attendants, servants, crowded into rooms with their lords. Others suggest distinct chambers for rank. The truth likely varied by wealth and era. Yet whether peasant or noble, few slept entirely alone. Darkness encouraged clustering. And what of disease? Even in castles, vermin crept in. Records of bedbug remedies appear not just in peasant guides, but in noble accounts too. Furs and feathers could hide as many pests as straw. Luxury did not mean immunity. You scratch at your skin again, wondering if even a princess in velvet cursed the same itching in her sleep. The tapestries stir faintly in the draught. You picture their embroidered saints and hunting scenes, more for insulation than art. They absorb sound, trap heat, make the chamber feel less like a cave. In your hut, patched cloth hangs on a rope. Here, embroidered hangings line walls. Two worlds, one purpose. Experts remain split on whether these grand chambers offered genuine rest or merely symbols of power. Some argue nobles slept better. Others insist they were just as cold, just as restless. The balance of evidence suggests comfort was relative better than straw, worse than you might dream. The wind outside howls, rattling shutters. A guard coughs on the battlement. Inside, the noble bedstead creaks as bodies shift under weight of furs. You sigh, realizing that no matter how high the walls or thick the mattress, medieval winter always won at least part of the battle. And perhaps that is the real symmetry. Whether in hut or castle, peasants and nobles alike endured the same season, listened to the same wind, prayed for the same dawn. The trappings differed, but the cold was shared. You close your eyes again, the grand chamber fading, the smoky hut returning. Straw scratches your back, goats shift at your feet, yet you carry the echo of the castle with you. Comfort, you think, is always relative. You stir when a small hand brushes your arm. It is the youngest child, eyes half open, whimpering softly. His cheeks are flushed from warmth, but his little fingers feel icy as he clutches your sleeve. You shift to make space, and soon he wriggles under the edge of your blanket, pressing close. This is no accident. In peasant huts, bedtime always began with the children. Contemporary household accounts show that families often tucked the youngest into bed first, long before the adults retired. The logic was simple. Children were most vulnerable to cold and illness, so they were settled earliest, cocooned in whatever blankets or straw the family could muster. Adults would stay up longer, tending the fire, finishing chores, or even keeping watch. Tonight, you can see it in practice, the youngest already asleep, the adults still murmuring in the corner, eyes scanning the coals. One curious little note comes from a 14th century parish record in England. Mothers were fined if infants froze in their sleep, the implication being that neglect was possible even in crowded huts. The fact that such laws existed shows how constant the danger was. You stroke the child's hair gently, realizing how fragile survival could be. The older children stretch out beside you, elbows and knees sharp, tangled together like puppies. They murmur in their dreams, muttering words you can't quite catch. A father at the far end of the bed watches over them, his body forming a barrier against the cold wall. Scholars sometimes argue about whether this arrangement was intentional, a nightly tactic, or simply instinct. Some suggest families consciously placed children in the warmest center, while others believe it was more accidental. Either way, the pattern emerges clearly. Protect the young by surrounding them. The hut smells of wool, smoke, and damp straw. You imagine the task of readying children for bed, pulling off their muddy shoes, rubbing their feet to warm them, wrapping them in the same tunics they wore by day. Few families owned extra garments for sleeping. A mother's lap might serve as a blanket until the child was drowsy enough to be laid in straw. It is a rhythm repeated every night, winter after winter. A peculiar anecdote appears in Dutch folklore. Children were sometimes told that angels watched them sleep only if they lay still, a trick to encourage quiet in cramped beds. The tale seems sweet, but you can imagine the relief of parents who finally got a moment of silence once the story sank in. Tonight, the children's snores prove the charm is unnecessary. Exhaustion does the work. You glance at the older siblings, who linger awake a little longer. They whisper to each other, giggling softly, then hush when their mother looks their way. Adolescents carried different roles. They might be asked to stir embers, fetch water, or keep an eye on animals before finally collapsing into the bedding. Childhood ended early in this world, and even sleep reflected it. The youngest were pampered with warmth, the older given responsibility before rest. Experts remain divided over how affectionate medieval parenting truly was. Some insist peasants were too burdened to indulge children, while others highlight folk songs, lullabies, and protective practices as proof of tenderness. The truth, as always, seems complicated. But lying here with a child curled against you, his small hand gripping your sleeve, you feel the unmistakable weight of care. Whatever hardship pressed on this family, they shielded their children first. The mother finally lies down, pulling another child into her arms. The father adjusts the blanket, covering as many little bodies as possible. A goat shifts at the foot of the bed, adding another pocket of warmth. Slowly, the hut grows quiet again, punctuated only by snores and the occasional cough. One odd tidbit from manorial court rolls records children sneaking from bed to steal food in the night, raiding pots left by the hearth. The fact that such mischief was noticed and punished shows how constant hunger was. You smile faintly, imagining the giggles of children tiptoeing across creaking floors. Perhaps tonight, though, exhaustion is too heavy for any midnight adventures. You lie still, surrounded by the soft, uneven breathing of children. Their warmth seeps into your side, fragile but real. You realize that for peasants, bedtime was not just rest, but rehearsal for resilience. Each night tested whether the family could keep its youngest alive. Each morning was proof that care, however makeshift, was enough. You close your eyes, letting the little hand on your sleeve anchor you. Perhaps luxury was never about furs or feathers, but about this, the simple relief of knowing the children will wake in the morning. You jolt awake to the sound of coughing. At first it is one thin wheeze, but then it multiplies the child beside you, the grandfather at the edge of the bed, even one of the travellers still huddled near the hearth. The smoky air feels heavier than before, laced with damp, And you realize this is more than the usual irritation of straw or fleas. Illness has slipped into the room, and in the cramped closeness of winter sleep, it spreads as quickly as breath itself. Contemporary parish records often list spikes in deaths during winter months, especially among infants and the elderly. Pneumonia, influenza, bronchitis. None were named exactly in medieval language, but the symptoms are familiar. Fevers of the chest and winter agues appear again and again in account books and death rolls. Tonight, listening to the chorus of coughs, you can hear why. One sneeze was enough to fill the hut with contagion. You glance around in the dim ember glow. The mother wipes a child's nose with her sleeve. The old man leans against the wall, each breath rattling, his face drawn tight with fatigue. In modern times, such illness might mean medicines, perhaps even hospitals. Here, it means prayers, herbal brews, and hope. And sometimes, it means loss. One peculiar remedy mentioned in a 15th century household guide involved warming onions in ashes and pressing them to the chest of a coughing child. The vapors were believed to draw out sickness. Another recipe mixed honey with vinegar, soothing throats even if it did nothing for the lungs. You imagine the family preparing such concoctions tomorrow, clinging to the comfort of doing something, anything, while illness lingered. Scholars remain divided on how devastating these winter illnesses truly were. Some argue that high mortality in records exaggerates the picture, since those documents emphasize deaths more than recoveries. Others insist that winter sickness was the greatest annual threat to peasants, greater even than hunger. The evidence is fragmentary, but as you listen to a child wheeze beside you, you feel the fragility of life in every sound. The air itself seems complicit. Moisture drips from rafters, dampening blankets and straw. Mold grows easily in such conditions, worsening coughs. The very closeness that saved peasants from freezing, breathing each other's warmth, pressing bodies together, became the same closeness that allowed fevers to spread unchecked. Survival was always a double-edged sword. You scratch your arm, restless, but it is not fleas keeping you awake now. It is the awareness that every cough in this room echoes the statistics of history. The countless children who did not survive winters like these. The countless families who buried more than they birthed. Archaeological studies of medieval cemeteries show high child mortality, many graves marked by bodies under 5 years old. Tonight, you lie beside one of those fragile lives, clutching his hand as though to anchor him to morning. The mother murmurs a prayer under her breath. Her lips move silently, eyes fixed on the fire. Faith was often the only medicine peasants possessed. Priests prescribed prayers. Saints were invoked for protection. Saint Blaise, in particular, was believed to guard against throat ailments. You wonder how many whispered appeals to him filled winter nights like this. One odd little superstition recorded in rural France claimed that hanging a piece of iron near the bed would ward off illness by cutting the fever. Whether symbolic or hopeful, such charms littered households. Perhaps even in this hut, some trinket rests above the door, unnoticed in the smoky gloom. The coughing quiets for now, exhaustion winning over sickness, but the atmosphere has changed. Sleep is no longer simply about warmth, it is about survival. You find yourself listening not to snores but to breathing, counting each rise and fall of the child's chest, reassured only when his body shifts against you. Experts remain divided on whether peasants accepted illness with resignation or fought it fiercely with remedies and rituals. Some accounts describe stoic acceptance, others desperate attempts to heal with herbs and charms. Likely, both responses coexisted, depending on circumstance. Tonight, you sense both in the mother's eyes, the resolve to endure, and the quiet fear of loss. You close your own eyes again, though uneasily. Every wheeze startles you, every sigh keeps you alert. But eventually, exhaustion overtakes even fear. The hut grows quieter, the coughs fading into shallow snores. You drift with them, knowing that dawn will not answer every question who survives, who worsens but at least offers light, and light itself is a kind of cure. Perhaps that is the harshest truth of medieval winters. Survival was not only about warmth, but about luck. To sleep through a night of coughing and wake still breathing was victory enough. You tighten the blanket around the child, feeling his small body steady against yours, and let yourself sink into another fragile stretch of rest. The air in the hut is heavy, still scented with smoke and sickness, when another sound slips in from outside. It is not the moan of the wind or the bark of dogs. It is music. Faint, distant, but real, the ringing of bells, the call of voices raised together. You blink in the dark, trying to orient yourself, and then you remember it must be Christmastide. For a few days each winter, life in the village looked different, even at night. Chronicles and church records alike describe how Christmas, Epiphany, or local saints' days brought rare brightness into the frozen calendar. Bonfires lit the village square, carols echoed through the lanes, and even peasants who scraped by on bread and turnips all year tasted roasted meat and warm drink. Tonight, you can imagine the glow spilling across the snow outside, a fire higher than any hearth, the air filled with smoke and song. Inside the hut, the family stirs. The mother rises quietly, pulling a cloak around her shoulders, and opens the door. A rush of cold air sweeps in, carrying the sound of distant merriment. The children wake, murmuring excitedly, and soon the hut is alive with whispers. Even the old man coughs less, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Winter is relentless, but festival nights punctured the gloom with warmth that was more than physical. One curious custom noted in England was the wassail bowl, a great pot of ale spiced with apples and cloves, passed from hand to hand. For peasants, such drink was rare treasure. They might taste it only once a year, and its memory carried them through lean months. In some villages, singers carried bowls house to house, blessing neighbours in exchange for food. You can almost hear the knock at the door, the chant of voices offering cheer against the frost. Scholars remain divided on how inclusive these festivities truly were. Some argue that peasants shared generously, pooling resources to feast together. Others insist that wealthier villagers hoarded the best foods, leaving the poor with scraps. The truth, as always, is muddled. But the fact that songs and stories emphasize communal warmth suggests that, at least in spirit, festivals created respite. The pig grunts as children tug at its ears, begging their parents to join the procession outside. The mother shakes her head, smiling wearily, but eventually nods. Bundled in cloaks, the family steps into the night. You follow, blinking at the sudden brightness. The square glows with a towering fire. Sparks leap into the sky, mixing with snowflakes. Villagers dance in circles, their voices hoarse but joyful. Someone beats a drum, another strums a lute, the rhythm infectious. It is a shock after so many nights of silence. The cold still bites, but the fire's blaze warms your cheeks. For once, you are not shivering in straw but swaying with neighbours, laughter rising. You feel the strange release that comes when hardship pauses, even briefly. The villagers know hunger will return tomorrow, that sickness lurks in every cough, but tonight they feast. One odd little tradition recorded in German towns was the Christmas mask, where men donned animal skins and horns, stomping through streets to scare away evil spirits. You catch a glimpse of such a figure in the firelight now, a man wrapped in goat hide, leaping and bellowing, children shrieking half in fear, half in delight. The ritual is rowdy, strange, but meant to protect the community from winter's malice. Back in the hut later, the difference lingers. The children, still flushed from firelight and sweet cakes, fall asleep quickly, smiles on their faces. The old man hums a carol under his breath. Even the travellers seem softened, their suspicion dulled by shared celebration. The air is no warmer, the straw no softer, but the atmosphere has changed. Spirits lifted, hearts lighter, survival feels possible again. Experts debate whether these festivals functioned more as religious devotion or social necessity. Some emphasize the church's role, Others see them as ancient communal rituals repurposed. Either way, they mattered. In the bleakness of medieval winter, a feast was more than food. It was a reminder that joy still existed. You lie back down, belly warmed by spiced ale, head filled with music. Outside, the fire crackles faintly, its glow fading as villagers drift home. Inside, the hut breathes easier, the weight of despair lifted, if only for a night. Perhaps this was the greatest function of winter festivals, not to erase suffering, but to remind everyone that life was more than suffering. That laughter, song, and warmth could pierce even the darkest nights. You close your eyes with that thought, a faint smile on your lips, and let the memory of fire carry you into another stretch of sleep. Sleep returns easily after the feast, but when it comes, it is heavy and vivid. You find yourself drifting into a dream so sharp it feels almost real. Hunger follows you even in sleep, shaping visions in peculiar ways. That was true for peasants across the Middle Ages. Their nights were not filled with gentle slumber, but with dreams etched by cold, want, and faith. From medieval sermons and folk tales, we know that dreams were often considered messages from God, from saints, or even from devils. People woke and retold them by the fire, measuring them for omens. Yet most dreams, scholars note, were probably fueled less by the supernatural than by empty stomachs and freezing beds. Tonight, you sense it yourself. Your mind drifts toward visions of bread, of glowing fires, of summers long gone. One odd little note from a 14th century physician's manual claims that eating garlic before bed produced dreams of demons. You chuckle, imagining a peasant blaming his nightmares on the evening stew. Whether or not the garlic was guilty, the connection between food and dreams fascinated people. Hunger, especially, carved strange stories in sleep. You turn in the straw, half aware of the child's breath against your arm, and your dream shifts darker. You are walking through snow, barefoot, searching for the hut, but the door never appears. This kind of anxious dream was surely common reflections of the constant fear of being caught outside after dark. Chronicles tell of villagers frozen mere yards from their doors, unable to find them in blizzards. It is easy to see how such fears bled into night visions. Scholars remain divided on whether peasants gave dreams deep meaning, or treated them as passing curiosities. Some evidence suggests peasants recorded dreams in confession, seeking guidance. Other evidence shows they laughed at them in the morning, dismissing them as tricks of the stomach. The line between sacred and ordinary blurred easily in medieval thought. The mother beside you stirs, murmuring in her sleep. You hear fragments of words, names, perhaps a prayer, and you wonder if she too is dreaming of saints or of fields. A father once told his children, according to a French folk tale, that dreaming of green meadows in winter was a blessing, proof that spring would come. You cling to that thought as your own vision shifts, the snow around you melting into streams of water, grass pushing through. But nightmares lurk as well. In medieval lore, demons called mare were said to sit on sleepers' chests, pressing them into suffocating dreams. Even today, we call it nightmare. You wake briefly, heart pounding, breath shallow, before realizing it was only the crush of bodies in the crowded bed. The pig's bulk pressing against your side mimicked that suffocating weight. You sigh, relieved, but you understand how easily such legends grew. One peculiar superstition recorded in parts of England advised placing a knife under the bed to ward off bad dreams, the blade pointed outward. Another suggested reciting a charm to St. Michael before sleep. Did such rituals work? Likely no more than garlic or onions. But they gave comfort, and comfort is itself a kind of remedy. The hut fills again with the steady chorus of snores and murmurs. Each sleeper is caught in their own world visions of food, of saints, of fears. You can almost sense the dreams around you, a mosaic of private struggles and hopes. Perhaps that was another form of survival. The mind, in sleep, creating warmth when the body could not. Experts still argue whether dreams influenced decisions. Did a peasant truly act on a vision of a saint, or simply shrug and return to work? Some accounts show entire villages altering plans based on dreams, while others suggest skepticism. The truth may be that in long winters, when nights stretched endlessly, dreams held more weight simply because there was little else to fill the hours. You turn again, straw crunching, and drift into another vision. This time you stand in a field of wheat, golden and endless, the sun warm on your skin. It feels too vivid to be illusion. Then a rooster crows in the real world, and the dream begins to dissolve. Still, the feeling lingers, the warmth, the plenty, the promise of life beyond frost. As you return to waking, you realize that dreams were perhaps the only luxury every class shared equally. Lords in their feather beds and peasants in their straw alike wandered through visions at night, shaped by hunger, fear, and hope. Comfort may have differed, but the mind's theatre belonged to all. You sigh, pulling the blanket tighter, holding on to the image of golden fields a little longer. In the cold dark of the hut, the dream is gone, but the hope it planted remains. And sometimes that was enough to keep peasants alive until spring. The rooster crows again, distant but insistent, and you stir from the dream of golden fields. The hut is still cloaked in darkness, yet the mood has shifted. It feels thicker somehow, as though unseen eyes press against the walls. The child beside you whimpers in his sleep, murmuring something about shadows at the door. His mother strokes his hair, whispering a prayer, and you realize you've entered another dimension of the medieval night. Superstition. People in this age believed that darkness was not empty. Spirits walked in it, demons slipped through cracks, and witches sometimes prowled unseen. Winter especially was feared, the long nights thought to open gates between worlds. To sleep, peasants often armed themselves not only with blankets and fire but with charms and muttered words of protection. Tonight, you feel the weight of that belief hovering above the rafters. One curious custom, recorded in rural England, involved placing iron scissors on a windowsill to cut the night spirits. Another advised sprinkling salt at doorways so witches could not pass. You glance toward the patched window, half expecting to see such objects glinting in the ember light. Perhaps they're there already, hidden beneath rags and straw. A peculiar anecdote from German folklore tells of the Alp, a creature that pressed down on sleepers' chests, stealing their breath. Villagers blamed it for nightmares and sudden suffocation. You chuckle nervously. How different is that from waking under the heavy weight of a pig, convinced you're being crushed? Even superstition, you realize, often had a kernel of truth in lived experience. Scholars continue to disagree about how seriously peasants believed these tales. Some argue they were light-hearted stories told to children, while others insist they were taken with deadly seriousness. Court records of witch trials show that fear could become lethal, yet many folktales treat spirits with humor, even mockery. Perhaps belief existed on a sliding scale, sometimes comforting, sometimes terrifying. The old man at the edge of the bed mutters a prayer aloud now, calling on St. Michael to guard the hut. His words blend with the sound of the wind clawing at the door. A goat stirs uneasily, bleating once, as though echoing his fear. You find yourself listening harder to every creak in the thatch, every whistle through the cracks, convinced for a moment that something truly is watching. Another superstition, this one from French villages, warned against pointing at the moon at night, lest spirits follow your finger back inside. Children were scolded for it, told that witches loved to enter homes that way. You imagine mothers hushing their little ones as they played near doorways, reminding them that the night had rules. One odd tidbit appears in a 15th century English sermon. It warned against singing loudly after midnight, lest demons be drawn to the noise. You smile faintly at the memory of the drunken villagers' song outside earlier. If demons were listening, perhaps they'd joined in. The child presses closer to you, whispering again about shadows. You tell him softly that the blanket is a shield, strong enough to keep spirits away. His eyes close, comforted more by your voice than by the cloth. That perhaps was the true purpose of these beliefs, to soothe fear, to turn chaos into rules people could follow. Experts remain divided on whether superstition actually helped peasants sleep better or whether it deepened anxiety. Some suggest charms offered psychological relief, allowing people to rest. Others argue they only fueled fear, reminding villagers of dangers every night. The answer may depend on perspective. Tonight, you feel both: a comfort in prayer, a shiver in every unexplained noise. The hut breathes steadily again, but you are slower to relax. You watch the rafters, half expecting condensation drops to turn into glowing eyes. Of course, nothing happens. Still, the sense of being watched lingers. You sigh, reminding yourself that every culture invents stories for the unknown, and the medieval world simply had more unknowns than most. Gradually, your eyelids grow heavy again. The goat quiets. The child sighs into deeper sleep, and the old man's muttering fades. You let yourself drift, still wrapped in superstition, still half convinced that angels and demons stand guard around the bed. Perhaps that is what winter nights were: battles not just against cold, but against the imagination, against the idea that the dark was full of forces beyond your control. And perhaps peasants survived by believing, by giving names to fear and charms to fight it. You close your eyes at last, blanket pulled high, and let the hut settle into silence. Whether spirits walk outside or not, the family sleeps on. Dawn will come. Until then, faith and fear hold the line together. The night drags on, and though your eyes are closed, you remain aware of every creak and sigh. Then, gradually, another sound rises. Voices, low at first, then swelling, melodic yet rough. You open your eyes and realize it comes from within the hut. The family is murmuring prayers, some half asleep, some fully awake. In this world, religion does not rest even at midnight. Medieval peasants lived in a rhythm, punctuated by bells and saints' days. But inside their homes, prayer marked private time as well. Many families prayed before bed, asking protection through the night. Some repeated short verses during waking moments when embers were stirred, when children coughed, when the wind howled outside. Tonight, you hear the repetition: Pater Noster, drifting softly over the straw. The Latin words are broken, misremembered, but their meaning is intact. From church manuals and folk records, we know bedtime prayers were common across Europe. Parents taught children verses like the Creed, sometimes shortened into rhymes. A mother might trace the sign of the cross on each forehead before lying down. You see her doing it now, her hand rough but gentle, moving from child to child in the smoky dark. One curious anecdote comes from a 15th century English chronicle describing a peasant family that recited the Lord's Prayer backwards, believing it trapped demons at the threshold. The priest condemned it as superstition, but the family swore it kept them safe. You chuckle softly. Sometimes faith blurred into folk magic, the line between them invisible in the night. Scholars still argue about how deeply peasants understood the prayers they recited. Some claim they were little more than rote words, mumbled without comprehension. Others argue they were heartfelt, shaping a worldview where the divine touched every corner of life. The debate lingers, but lying here among whispers, you sense the prayers carried weight, even if only as rhythm to steady anxious minds. The old man's voice rises above the others, cracked but strong. He chants a psalm fragment, perhaps remembered from a church service decades ago. The words tumble out imperfect, but the cadence soothes. The children listen, their eyes wide, then slowly close again as sleep claims them. It feels less like performance, more like lullaby. You think of monasteries again, where chants echoed in stone halls at midnight. The peasants mirror that rhythm in their own rough way, not with polished voices but with simple murmurings. Faith shaped both worlds, formal in cloisters, improvised in cottages. One odd little detail preserved in folk custom: some households sprinkled holy water on straw before bed, convinced it repelled sickness and spirits. Whether it worked or not, it added a sense of sanctity to the smoky mess. You imagine the faint splash, the straw darkening for a moment, the family sighing with relief. The prayers fade, replaced by silence. Yet the effect lingers. The room feels less fearful, less burdened. Even the goat seems calmer, settling its head against the floor with a soft grunt. You realize that belief, whatever its accuracy, had power to soften nights otherwise dominated by fear and discomfort. Experts remain split on whether prayer made peasants feel more control over their lives or whether it reminded them of their powerlessness. Some argue that invoking saints gave people agency. Others claim it only reinforced dependence on forces beyond them. As you drift back toward drowsiness, you suspect both are true. Prayer gave structure, but also surrender. You sigh, nestling into the straw. The words of the prayers echo faintly in your ears, mingling with the crackle of embers and the hush of breathing. They are imperfect, often misunderstood, but they are steady, and steadiness is precious in a world of constant uncertainty. Perhaps that is why peasants clung to prayer at night, not because it banished cold or hunger, but because it gave shape to fear. In the silence between snores and sighs, faith whispered reassurance. You let your eyes close again, drifting into the rhythm of murmur and silence, and realize, for all the smoke, fleas, and draughts, the medieval night was never truly empty. It was filled with words rising toward heaven, fragile as breath, yet strong enough to carry families through the dark. You are almost asleep again when a sharp noise cuts through the night, a loud thud against the door. Everyone stirs at once. The children gasp. The goat bleats. The pig shuffles nervously in the straw. For a moment, the only sound is the wind slipping through cracks, but then comes another knock, firmer, closer, as though someone is testing the latch. Fear prickles across the hut. You realize how vulnerable you are. One thin wooden bar, one flimsy plank door, standing between the family and whatever prowls outside. Medieval cottages were not fortresses. Theft, though less romanticized than raids and battles, was a constant worry in rural life. Court records list countless fines for stolen pigs, chickens, or sacks of grain. In winter, when hunger sharpened desperation, thieves often prowled by night. Tonight, you hear the danger for yourself. The father rises quickly, grabbing the only weapon at hand, a wooden staff kept near the hearth. His eyes flick to the strangers still huddled in straw, suspicion glimmering. Are they truly guests? Or could they have allies waiting outside? Trust is fragile in the dark. He gestures for silence, then creeps toward the door. One curious account from a 14th century manorial roll describes villagers setting traps outside their cottages, pits disguised with brush, or noisy boards to startle intruders. Such measures may have worked, but they also reveal the constant anxiety of peasants who owned so little, yet had so much to lose. A single pig stolen could mean famine. The knock comes again, louder this time. The mother hushes the children, whispering a prayer. The old man mutters something about wolves, though the sound is clearly human. Wolves might scratch, but they don't knock. You hold your breath as the father shouts through the door, demanding to know who stands outside. No answer comes, only the shuffle of feet retreating into snow. Debate among historians continues about how common rural theft truly was. Some argue it was rampant, fueled by poverty and scarcity. Others suggest manorial courts exaggerated the problem to justify fines and control. The truth is probably uneven. Some villages plagued by raids, others rarely troubled. But when you live in a hut where one latch guards all your possessions, paranoia is inevitable. Inside, the tension lingers. The father replaces the bar, then sits awake by the hearth, staff across his knees. His silhouette glows faintly in the ember light, a silent sentinel against the night. The rest of the family shifts uneasily, but eventually exhaustion wins. They return to slumber, though fitful. You lie awake longer, heart thudding, realizing that even in bed, sleep was never free from fear. One odd little superstition claimed that placing a broom across the threshold at night would confuse spirits or thieves, forcing them to count each straw before entering. Was it practical defense? Not really, but it shows how creative villagers became in guarding against unseen dangers. Perhaps this family keeps their own broom by the door. Perhaps that too was part of tonight's protection. The goat eventually relaxes, laying its head on your legs. The pig sighs, curling back into straw. The children stop whimpering. Only the father remains alert, staring into the dark. You realize how heavy such vigilance must have been, repeated night after night. Experts remain divided on whether fear of theft made peasants sleep poorly or whether, over time, they simply accepted it as another fact of life. Some argue anxiety gnawed at them constantly. Others believe routine dulled the edge of worry. You suspect both are true fear, sharp at times like this, dull the rest of the year. You sigh into the smoky air, pulling the blanket closer, and finally let your eyes drift shut again. The father's watchful figure still looms by the hearth, a fragile barrier against hunger-driven strangers. Perhaps that was the truest nature of medieval sleep, never fully secure, never fully peaceful. The body might rest, but the mind always listened for knocks in the night. The hut is still, but your thoughts churn as you drift back into half-sleep. One question circles in your mind. How did they endure? How did peasants survive night after night in such conditions? Thin walls, fleas, drafts, sickness, hunger, strangers at the door. You lie awake, trying to piece it together, and realize you're asking the same question scholars have wrestled with for generations. Archaeologists uncover soot-blackened timbers, scraps of wool, bones of livestock, and yet the picture remains incomplete. Some researchers argue that peasants adapted physically and mentally to the hardships, building resilience that modern bodies could scarcely imagine. Others counter that suffering was constant, that winters were endured rather than conquered. The evidence, patchy as it is, cannot give a single answer. Tonight, lying in the smoky dark, you feel the puzzle acutely. One concrete fact stands out. Mortality was high. Burial records from English villages show spikes in January and February, with children and the elderly most vulnerable. Some historians emphasize these numbers as proof that winter was a yearly crisis, not merely an inconvenience. Others suggest the records reflect only the worst years, and that many families did muddle through most winters without catastrophe. The debate is ongoing, unresolved. You think of what you've seen in this hut, blankets patched together, goats pressed close, prayers whispered in the dark. Each strategy offers some relief, but none erase the cold entirely. Perhaps survival wasn't about conquering the night, but about layering small defenses, cloth against drafts, herbs against fleas, charms against fear. No single tactic saved them, but the accumulation made life just bearable enough. A peculiar tidbit from a 14th century account describes a village in Flanders where families moved into barns with their animals for the deepest part of winter, abandoning houses altogether. Whether exaggeration or truth, it reveals how far people were willing to go to cheat the cold. You glance at the pig beside you, and the idea doesn't seem so absurd. Even with such measures, the toll on the body was relentless. Chronic joint pain, frostbitten fingers, and lung damage from smoke all appear in medical writings of the time. You scratch at your arm, feeling the weight of those conditions, imagining the aching bones of peasants who never knew a truly warm night. Modern comforts, central heating, soft beds, sealed windows make their endurance seem impossible. Yet they lived, worked, raised children, and filled villages with life. Experts remain split on whether peasants accepted their lot with resignation or whether they dreamed constantly of better lives. Some argue their folklore, filled with visions of feasts and warm halls, proves longing. Others emphasize their jokes and songs mocking nobles, suggesting they found humor and resilience even in misery. The truth likely lies between envy tempered by laughter, despair softened by community. You turn in the straw, watching condensation drip from rafters. And consider another angle. Maybe the question is not how they endured, but why. The answer, you realize, is simple because they had no choice. Endurance was not a virtue but a necessity. Winter demanded submission, and those who submitted, who bent rather than broke, survived. Yet there is dignity in that survival. You see it in the mother soothing her coughing child, in the father keeping vigil with his staff, in the old man muttering prayers through chattering teeth. They did not conquer the cold, but they refused to let it conquer them entirely. That refusal, repeated every night, was its own form of strength. One odd little superstition recorded in Scandinavia said that those who laughed at the cold would not feel it so badly. You smile faintly at the thought of peasants forcing jokes at night, mocking their own misery. Perhaps humour itself was one of those small defences, as necessary as straw and wool. The fire flares faintly as an ember catches, throwing shadows across the wall. You watch them flicker and realize how fragile the whole system was dependent on a dozen improvised tricks, none perfect, all essential. Scholars may never agree on whether peasants adapted or suffered endlessly, but inside this hut you see both truths. They suffered, yes, but they also adapted, because there was no other path. You close your eyes again, reflecting on that paradox. Survival was neither triumph nor failure, it was the stubborn in-between. The peasant's legacy is not one of conquering the winter night, but of outlasting it one cough, one prayer, one ember, one shiver at a time. The night crawls on, and the smoky hush of the hut presses around you. Your body aches from straw lumps, from the elbows and knees of bedfellows, from the relentless chill that never fully lifts. Yet you are struck by a quieter thought. Not every night in winter was this miserable. Some nights carried laughter, stories, even tenderness. To understand how peasants survived, you must also imagine those softer hours when community itself was the blanket. When the fire burned a little brighter, and bellies were a little fuller, after a feast day, perhaps, or the slaughter of a pig, families often lingered awake, telling stories. Folklorists believe many of the fairy tales we know today took shape in smoky huts like this one, whispered while children dozed against their parents. Tonight, you hear the old man's voice lift, weaving a tale about a fox who tricks a farmer, his words slow and gravelly, the children giggling even half asleep. Stories were entertainment, yes, but also teaching tools, warnings against greed, lessons about cleverness, reminders of saints' miracles. One curious note from French sources suggests that riddles were a popular pastime during these hours. Simple questions passed around the hearth. What runs but never moves? What has a mouth but does not speak? Such games filled the dark with something other than fear. You smile, imagining tired peasants puzzling over these mysteries, momentarily forgetting the fleas that gnawed at them. Scholars remain divided on how significant these moments of storytelling were. Some argue they were rare, overshadowed by exhaustion. Others insist they were central, giving peasants a shared culture that bound them together. Archaeology cannot tell us, but listening to the murmurs in this hut, you sense the power of words to soften even the coldest night. Songs, too, belonged here. A mother hums softly, a tune you do not recognize, perhaps a local lullaby passed down through generations. Her voice is cracked, yet soothing. The child against your side sighs and nestles closer. Music did not need instruments, it needed only breath. A fragment of melody could outlast hunger for a moment, carrying hope. A peculiar anecdote appears in a 15th century chronicle. A lord visiting a village was shocked to find peasants laughing and singing late into the night, despite their poverty. He scolded them for idleness, but they replied, "If we cannot laugh, we will die faster." That response lingers with you. Laughter itself was survival. The strangers at the hearth stir and share their own tale, a journey delayed by snow, a farmer who gave them shelter the night before. Their voices add to the chorus, weaving outsiders into the family fabric. Suspicion softens into fellowship, if only for tonight. You realize that winter blurred the lines between household and community. Nights were not always private. They were occasions for connection. Even small gestures mattered. A piece of bread divided among children, a coal loaned to a neighbour, a joke muttered into the straw, each became part of the toolkit against despair. Experts debate whether peasants thought of these acts as charity or simply routine, but either way, they made survival communal. Alone, a family might falter. Together, they stood a better chance. The old man finishes his fox story, and silence falls again, but it is warmer silence, tinged with faint smiles. You lie back, realizing that these softer moments may never appear in court rolls or church records, yet they were as real as hunger and frost. They were the glue that held the human spirit together when the body suffered. The fire crackles weakly, but the warmth inside the hut now comes from another source. The hum of voices, the bond of shared struggle. You feel it seep into you, gentler than wool, stronger than straw. Perhaps this is what historians sometimes miss when they tally deaths and famine. The resilience of peasants was not only physical but emotional. They endured not only through rags and goats, but through stories, songs, and laughter. Those invisible comforts left no trace in archaeology, but without them, no one would have survived at all. You sigh, letting the memory of the tale wrap around you like an extra blanket. Your eyes close once more, and you think, maybe the true warmth of a medieval winter night came not from the fire, nor the animals, nor the patched blanket, but from the voices of others reminding you that you were not alone. The night stretches toward its end. You sense it in the stillness of the hut, in the way even the pig has stopped shifting, in the faint paling at the window where snow reflects the earliest light. After so many interruptions, drafts, fleas, coughs, knocks, prayers, there comes at last a lull. It is not silence, not really, but a gentler rhythm of breath. You lie in the straw, reflecting on how these countless fragments weave together into the fabric of peasant sleep. Every detail you have witnessed, patched blankets, smoky embers, goats pressed close, whispered prayers, belongs to the wider story of endurance. Surviving a medieval winter's night was not about any single solution. It was about stacking defenses, one upon another, fur on wool, body against body, prayer layered over fear. The hut itself was a quilt, stitched from scraps of necessity. One surviving inventory from 15th century England lists a household's entire bedding as one sheet, one blanket, one coverlet. That was it. You think of how those 3 scraps might have been stretched across 6 or 7 people, and you realize the miracle is not that people were cold, but that they lived at all. A peculiar anecdote appears in a village chronicle. A woman recalled that her family judged mornings by whether frost formed on their eyebrows as they slept. If not, it was a warm night. You smile faintly at the gallows humour. Tonight, you can almost feel frost glittering on your own lashes. Experts remain divided on how peasants themselves perceived these conditions. Did they think of them as hardship, or simply as life? Some argue peasants complained constantly, others that they accepted the cold as inevitable. The debate continues. Yet as you listen to the family stir, you suspect resignation was mixed with resilience. They cursed the cold, yes, but they kept rising, kept tending fires, kept patching blankets. The father sits up first, stoking the hearth back to life. The embers crackle, the room fills with smoky light, and children blink awake. The mother pulls on her cloak, tying it with stiff fingers. The old man coughs, then stretches, joints cracking like dry twigs. Even the travellers stir, brushing frost from their cloaks. Another night survived, another dawn earned. One odd little practice mentioned in some folk accounts was thanking the fire in the morning, as though it were a companion. You see the father pause a moment, hand hovering above the flame, lips moving. Was it prayer or gratitude? You cannot tell, but either way it carries the same meaning. Acknowledgement that survival was never guaranteed. The hut begins to hum with the small sounds of mourning children yawning, animals snuffling, water being poured from a frozen jug. The night's terrors retreat, but they are never forgotten. Winter will demand the same battle again tonight, and the night after, until spring loosens its grip. And you, lying here in the straw, realize the deeper truth. Peasants did not survive winter nights by finding comfort. They survived by accepting discomfort as constant, by finding scraps of joy in songs, in stories, in faith, in each other's warmth. Sleep was not a retreat from struggle. It was part of the struggle itself. Perhaps that is why so many medieval prayers asked simply for a good night's rest. Not a peaceful life, not endless comfort, just the chance to wake again at dawn. And as light finally seeps through the patched window, you understand the modesty of that wish. To live through the night was itself a victory. The story softens now, the sharp edges of cold and hunger fading into gentler reflections. Picture the hut one last time, smoke rising lazily from the hearth, blankets patched but clutched tightly, children curling against parents, animals sighing in the straw. The long night has passed, and though discomfort lingers, the family has done what mattered most. They endured. Let your breathing slow with theirs, steady and calm. Imagine the crackle of the revived fire, not fierce but constant, like a whisper promising warmth. Outside, snow lies heavy on the fields, but inside, human persistence has kept life alive. The night was long, yet dawn has arrived, as it always does. Think, too, of the small victories hidden in each detail: a scrap of cloth turning into a canopy, a goat lending its heat to a child's feet, a whispered prayer soothing fear. None of these erased hardship, yet together they created survival. That was the rhythm of medieval winters. Never comfort, but always endurance. Let that image settle in your mind, the knowledge that people before you faced nights far colder, far darker, and still found ways to laugh, to dream, to sing. Their resilience is not distant history. It is a reminder that the human spirit bends but does not break. Now, as you drift further toward rest, imagine the hut growing quieter, embers glowing softly, breath rising like mist in the dim air. You are part of that ancient rhythm, lying among them, safe enough for now. The world outside can wait. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. The long night is over. Sweet dreams.